Ensign Dal Ray was 3 hours into a shift that should have held nothing but static when the sensor well returned a mass reading that could not exist. He tapped the console twice, the way you tap a stuck gauge, and the number held. 47 hulls, materializing out of nothing at the edge of the picket line, none of them matching a single silhouette in the Thren Dominion's registry. He opened his mouth to call it in and then closed it again, because the correct words did not exist yet. What he had on the display looked less like a fleet than a wound opening in the dark. He called it in anyway. "Picket Control, this is Outpost 6 Ril. I have unregistered contacts." "Repeat, unregistered. I don't have a silhouette match on anything." His voice cracked on the second sentence and he hated himself for it. 47 signatures, they just appeared. There was no transit flare. There was no drive wake. They were not there and then they were. The voice that answered him was bored in the specific way that senior officers are bored with junior officers who have just discovered that the universe is larger than their training manual. 6 Ril, run a diagnostic. You're reading ghosts. Dahl ran the diagnostic. The ghost stayed. 200,000 kilometers coreward, at the command tier of the Thren Dominion warship Bloodclaim of the 2nd Correction Fleet. Fleet-Marshal Voran Ashkel was not thinking about ghosts. He was thinking about the surrender terms he intended to read aloud to Aldrun Hold in the next 11 hours, and about how satisfying it would be to watch the Hold's warden hear them. Aldrun Hold hung in the forward viewport, a rust-colored moon strung with the lights of 4 million people who had spent the last 19 days under blockade, their orbital defenses cracked, their single relief convoy burned in the first hour of the siege. 600 Dominion warships held the ring around it. Behind them, spread across 40 light minutes of the Amrith Verge, sat the rest of the 2nd Correction Fleet, nearly 4,000 hulls in total, the largest single force the Dominion had committed to a border action in a generation, all of it gathered to make an example of one small world that had refused politely to acknowledge Dominion sovereignty. Ashkel liked the math of it. 600 warships to break a moon with no fleet of its own. It was not a battle. It was an arithmetic problem with the answer already known, and he found there was a particular pleasure in solving problems whose answers were already known. His aide, Registrar Ilan Vase, stepped onto the command tier holding a data slate the way other officers held weapons, carefully, and a little afraid of it. Vase had spent 30 years cataloging dead civilizations for the Dominion Archive before Ashkel had requisitioned him for this campaign, on the theory that a man who knew every species that had ever failed to survive contact with the Dominion would be useful company on a campaign meant to add one more name to that list. "Marshal, Outpost 6 Ril is reporting unregistered contacts at the edge of the picket line. 47 hulls. No transit signature." Ashkel did not turn from the viewport. "Pirates. The size class doesn't match any pirate consortium in the sector, Marshal. Individually, the contacts read larger than anything in a rating profile. Collectively, they read larger than anything in a rating profile times 10. "Then they're lost." Ashkel finally looked at him. "Run it against the full registry. All of it. I don't want to hear about it again until you have an answer, and I want the answer before the Hold surrender window opens." Vase inclined his head and withdrew to the archive terminal at the rear of the tier, already regretting that he had not simply solved the problem before mentioning it. He fed the sensor return into the classification engine and watched it chew through 400 years of the Dominion's collected knowledge of every spacefaring species it had ever fought, traded with, conquered, or cataloged as extinct. It took the engine 6 minutes to return 0 matches on active registry. It took another 4 to return 1 match on the archive of dead and mythical peoples, a designation so old that Vase had to authorize his own clearance twice before the record would open. When it did, the header alone made him sit back in his chair. Species human. HOMEWORLD. Terra designation unconfirmed. Status Extinct, probable / mythological confirmed use. Last VERIFIED contact, 314 standard years prior. Note: species associated with the vanished kin cycle, a cautionary narrative tradition found across 17 client cultures, typically employed to illustrate the consequences of hubristic expansion beyond sustainable resource horizons. No physical specimen, wreckage, or transmission recovered since. He read it 3 times before he carried it to the marshal, and even then he did not quite believe the words coming out of his own mouth. Marshal, the classification engine returns a partial match. It isn't a current species, it's a myth. The vanished kin, the ones who flew into the dark chasing a dying star and never came back. Children's cautionary stories use the name, humans. For the first time since the briefing had begun, Ashkel actually laughed, a short hard sound with no warmth in it. A bedtime story just parked 47 warships on my picket line. The signature profile is unusual, Marshal. I'd want a closer scan before. Get me a closer scan, then. I don't have patience for ghost stories with an 11-hour surrender clock running. Ashkel turned back to the viewport, to Aldrun Hold's lights, already composing the next line of the speech he intended to give the Hold's warden. Send a recon flight. Have them read the hulls properly and report back before I open the surrender channel. I want this settled, not haunting me. He opened a private channel to the surface an hour later, more out of habit than necessity, because he had found across a dozen border campaigns that a besieged world's leadership softened faster when the threat behind an ultimatum had a face attached to it rather than a formal written notice. Warden Bellic Thrase's image resolved on the display, looking exactly as exhausted as 19 days of siege should have left him, and Ashkel found, watching him, the particular satisfaction of a man confirming that his arithmetic still favored him. Warden, I trust the last 3 weeks have clarified your position. Our position has not changed, Marshal, and I doubt 3 more weeks would change it either. Thrase's voice was rough but steady. You have broken our orbital defenses. You have not broken us. That distinction rarely survives a 4th week, Warden. I've watched it fail on 11 other worlds. Ashkel allowed himself a thin, unhurried smile, the smile of a man who had said some version of this sentence enough times to have worn it smooth. I am prepared to open formal surrender terms at the top of the next cycle. I would encourage you to have your counsel ready to receive them, so that the next chapter of this can be a great deal gentler than the one you've just survived. And if we decline again, and the 4th week looks a great deal less gentle than the first 3, and every death after this hour belongs to your refusal, not my patience. Ashkel closed the channel without waiting for a reply, because he had found over the years that leaving the warden's answer unheard made the threat land harder than any response could have softened it, and turned back to the viewport satisfied that the arithmetic of the siege remained exactly where he had left it, unaware in that hour, that 40 light minutes away. The arithmetic of the entire campaign had already begun quietly rewriting itself without his permission. 40 light minutes away, aboard a ship that did not yet have a name in any Dominion registry, Lieutenant Commander Ren Calder stood on the command deck of the TFS Ember Vigil and watched the last of the transit haze bleed off the forward screens to reveal a starfield that no living member of her fleet had ever personally seen before. She was 24 years old. She had been born in the 3rd year after departure, 400 meters aft of where she now stood, in a medical bay that had, at the time, still smelled of the shipyard that built it. She had never set foot on a world with an atmosphere she hadn't manufactured herself. She had grown up on stories of a blue planet she had never seen, told to her by a grandfather who had seen it, and who now stood 3 meters to her left with both hands folded behind his back, looking at the same unfamiliar stars she was. Admiral Josiah Calder was 61 years old, silver at the temples, built like a man who had spent 3 decades doing manual repairs in vacuum suits, because a fleet 300 light-years from any shipyard could not afford officers who wouldn't get their hands dirty. He had been a junior engineer of 19 when the Long Dark forced the launch. He was the last man alive on the Ember Vigil who remembered Earth's sky. "Report," he said without turning. "Transit complete, full fleet accounted for," Wren said. 47 hulls, no losses, no major system faults. We are exactly where the nav solution said we'd be. She paused, reading the tactical returns scrolling up beside the starfield. "And we're not alone out here, Admiral. I'm reading a blockade formation 40 light minutes coreward. 600-plus warships, unknown configuration, positioned around a populated body. Weapons fire signatures in the debris field around it, recent, within the last 3 weeks." Josiah Calder's jaw tightened, the only sign he gave that the number meant anything to him at all. Someone's under siege. "Looks that way." "Population estimate." "I can get a better one once we're closer." "Preliminary thermal bloom off the moon puts inhabited structures in the low millions." He was quiet for a long moment, and Wren watched him do the thing she had watched him do her entire life. Take a fact that would have made most men flinch and turn it over slowly until he found the piece of it that was actionable. It was the same habit that had kept 47 ships and 11,000 souls alive across 3 centuries of deep dark with no home port, no resupply, and no one coming to help. You did not survive the Long Dark by flinching. You survived it by finding the next right thing to do, and doing it before the fear caught up with you. "We didn't cross 300 light-years of nothing to watch someone get strangled 40 minutes from our own emergence point," he said finally. "Signal the fleet. We hold position 20 minutes, run full diagnostics, and then we go take a look at who's doing the strangling." "Yes, sir." Wren hesitated because it was the question every officer on the deck was thinking and none of them had asked yet. "Admiral, do we know anything about them, the force out there?" "No." He finally turned from the screen, and there was something in his face that Wren had rarely seen there, not fear. He did not do fear, but the particular weight of a man carrying a promise that predated her birth. "But your great-grandmother didn't write the kindling oath with an asterisk on it. It doesn't say help the weak unless the ones crushing them turn out to be inconvenient. It says when you find the weak being crushed, you carry the fire to them. We don't get to renegotiate that from a nice safe distance because the math looks bad." "The math might look very bad, sir." For the first time since the transit alarm had sounded, Josiah Calder almost smiled. "Then it's a good thing we've had 314 years to get good at bad math." He gave the order. 47 warships, weathered and scarred and grown twice over from the 12 fragile arcs that had fled a dying solar system 3 centuries before, came about as one and began to accelerate toward Aldrune Hold, toward 600 warships that did not know they were about to become the second entry in a story the wider galaxy had already, quietly, closed the book on. Behind them, further out along their wake, 13 more contacts were still resolving out of transit haze, reserve elements, slower ships, the Ember Vigil support train catching up. Ahead of them, a Dominion recon flight of 4 light interceptors had just broken from the picket line on Fleet-Marshal Ashkel's order, accelerating outward to get their closer scan of 47 warships that a myth catalog said should not exist. Neither side yet understood what the other one was. The 4 Dominion interceptors closed to scanning range in 18 minutes, running a standard sweep profile, hull composition, drive signature, weapons loadout, crew complement estimate, all of it meant to feed back into Vace's classification engine and settle the matter of what, exactly, had parked itself on the 2nd Correction Fleet's flank. Flight leader Coram Dassa had run 400 of these sweeps in his career. He expected this one to look like every other one, an unfamiliar hull class, probably a splinter faction or a deep frontier trading concern that had never registered with the Dominion, easily catalogued, easily dismissed. He brought his flight in on the trailing edge of the human formation, angled his sensors on the nearest hull, a blunt-nosed cruiser riding at the edge of the Ember Vigil's escort screen, and opened the sweep. The return that came back made no sense, and it kept making no sense the longer he stared at it. The hull registered as solid metal composite plating nearly a meter thick in places, layered and relayered, weld seams overlapping weld seams the way tree rings overlap each other. A ship that had been rebuilt, reinforced, and rebuilt again, not once but dozens of times, by hands that had never once had access to a proper shipyard. The drive signature didn't match any propulsion architecture in the Dominion's registry. It read hot and strange and far too efficient for a hull that old. And the weapons loadout. DASA ran it twice because the first pass had to be an error. Every visible hardpoint on the human cruiser was live and charged, not standby, not powered down for a peaceful approach. Charged, the way you keep a weapon charged when you have already decided, before anyone spoke a word to you, that you might need to use it. Picket Control Recon Flight 2. His voice was tighter than he wanted it to be. I'm reading the contact hulls as military grade, fully armed, and I mean fully, every hardpoint hot. This isn't a trade convoy. This is a battle line. Copy, Recon 2. Marshal wants a hull count and configuration profile before. The channel cut out. It did not degrade, did not crackle, did not do any of the things a channel does when it is jammed or damaged. It simply stopped, the way a sentence stops when someone closes their hand around your throat mid-word. On DASA's own console, every readout froze at once: sensors, comms, drive telemetry. And in the half-second before his ship's independent recorder lost power as well, it captured a final sensor frame that would later be pulled from the wreckage and passed hand to hand through the Dominion's intelligence core like something radioactive. The frame showed the human cruiser had not fired a visible weapon at all. It had simply reached out with something in the electromagnetic spectrum that the Dominion had no name for, something that moved faster than any targeting solution DASA's ship could have plotted a defense against, and switched his interceptor off the way you switch off a light. All 4 ships of Recon Flight 2 went dark within the same 11 seconds. No wreckage, no debris field, no distress beacon. One moment there were 4 Dominion interceptors closing on the human formation's trailing edge, and the next there was nothing on the sensor return at all, as if the ships had simply been erased from the part of space they had been occupying. Dalray watched it happen from Outpost 6 ril, 40 seconds light lag behind the event, and felt something cold settle into his stomach that had nothing to do with the recycled air in his suit. He filed the report exactly as the returns showed it, because he had already learned once today what it cost to soften a report to make it easier for a senior officer to hear, and he was done doing that. Picket Control, this is Outpost 6 ril. Recon Flight 2 is dark. All 4 contacts lost simultaneously. No wreckage signature, no weapons discharge on record prior to loss. I am reclassifying the unregistered formation as an active hostile force of unknown capability. I recommend the Marshal be advised before the hold surrender window opens, not after. This time, no one told him he was reading ghosts. Fleet Marshal Ashkel received the report standing at the viewport with Aldrune Hold still hanging in front of him, its lights unchanged, its 4 million people still unaware that the balance of the siege above their heads had just shifted in a direction no one in this sector had a name for yet. 4 interceptors, gone, no wreckage. He said it flatly, testing the shape of the words the way a man tests ice before he puts his weight on it. Yes, Marshal. Vace's voice had lost its careful, archivist's calm. There was no detectable weapons discharge in the telemetry we recovered. Whatever removed them did it without triggering a single sensor flag on our side, until it was already finished. That's not a weapon. That's a lie the sensors are telling us because the truth is inconvenient. Ashkel's hands, still folded behind his back, closed into fists, Not fear. Vase was almost certain it was not fear, not yet, but the particular fury of a man who has just watched an equation he trusted produce an answer he refused to accept. 600 warships against 47. That was not a fight. That was a rounding error. Recalculate the hull count. I want to know exactly what we're looking at before I commit anything larger than a probe to it again. Marshal, I would recommend caution. I did not ask for a recommendation, Registrar. I asked for a hull count. Ashkel turned from the window at last, and there was color in his face now, the flush of a man whose morning had gone from arithmetic to insult in the space of 11 seconds. Signal the 4th strike wing. 200 ships, full weapons release authorization. I want that formation identified, contained, and if it resists, destroyed before the hold's people get any foolish ideas about who's coming to rescue them. 200 light minutes away, close enough now that the light lag had shrunk to seconds. The 4th strike wing broke from the main blockade line and began its burn outward. 200 Dominion warships accelerating on an intercept course toward a fleet a fifth their size, carrying orders that assumed the arithmetic still favored them. Aboard the Ember Vigil, the sensor officer's report reached the command deck almost the same moment the Dominion strike wing lit its drives. Admiral, we have 200 contacts breaking from the main blockade formation, accelerating toward us. Weapons hot across the board. Time to intercept, 40 minutes at current burn. Josiah Calder did not look surprised. He looked, if anything, like a man confirming something he had already suspected. They sent a probe first. For light craft, yes, sir. They closed to scanning range on the Kestrel and the Holloway before we, the sensor officer hesitated, choosing the word carefully, before we responded. Casualties on our side? None, sir. The Kestrel's point defense grid handled it without a shot fired from any crewed station. Automated response, well within engagement parameters. Wren felt the small, cold twist of that sentence settle into the room. Nobody on the Ember Vigil had pulled a trigger. A ship's own defense grid, built and rebuilt across 3 centuries by hands that had never once had the luxury of assuming a threat wouldn't come, had simply done what it was built to do, and 4 Dominion pilots had ceased to exist without a single human being making the decision in real time. It was not a comfortable thought. She filed it away to be uncomfortable about later, because 200 more ships were now burning straight toward her fleet, and there was no room on the command deck for anything but the next decision. 200 ships against 47, she said. That's not a probe anymore, Admiral. That's a commitment. It's a mistake, Josiah Calder said, but it's the mistake I'd expect from someone who's never had to fight for scraps in his life. Signal the fleet. Formation kindling, the old pattern, the one your great-grandmother drilled us on before we'd even cleared the heliopause. Wren, you have tactical. I want the Ember Vigil's main line held steady, and I want the escort screen doing exactly what it was built to do. Show them what 300 years of building our own weapons out of asteroid ore and spite actually looks like. Yes, sir. Wren stepped to the tactical station, and for the first time since transit, felt the old fear under her ribs settle into something else. Not gone, never gone, but pointed now, useful, the way her grandfather had taught her fear could be if you refused to let it drive instead of ride along. 47 ships, 200 incoming, 600 behind that, nearly 4,000 somewhere further out that the Ember Vigil sensors hadn't even fully resolved yet. She had grown up on stories of a blue planet she had never seen. She had never once, in 24 years, imagined that her first real battle would be fought this far from it, for the sake of 4 million strangers whose names she did not know, against an enemy who had just tried to erase her fleet from a sensor board the way you erase a rounding error. She found she did not mind. The oath did not come with an asterisk, neither apparently did she. Formation kindling is set, she said. Weapons crews report ready across the line. Recommend we let them close to effective range before we show them anything more than the shape of what's coming. Josiah Calder allowed himself, finally, a small and humorless smile. Patient, good. Your great-grandmother would have liked that. 200 Dominion warships bore down on 47 human hulls that had not moved from their formation, had not fled, had not so much as raised a shield harder than standing orders already required. And somewhere behind them, coreward, past the 600 ships ringing Aldroon hold, the rest of the Second Correction Fleet continued making its slow, patient, and entirely unwarranted preparations to force a surrender from a world it did not yet understand was no longer alone. The Fourth Strike Wing closed to engagement range in 38 minutes, 200 Dominion warships spreading into a standard envelopment crescent, designed to fold around a smaller force from 3 sides at once. It was a formation built for numbers, not finesse, the kind of tactic a fleet used when it had never once needed a better one, because it had never once faced an enemy who could survive being surrounded. Wren watched the crescent form on the tactical plot and felt something in her chest that was almost pity. "They're enveloping," she said. "Standard 3-axis fold, no reserve held back. They're treating us like we'll break formation to defend a flank." She glanced at her grandfather. "They don't know we don't have a soft flank, sir." "They will," Josiah Calder said. "Let them commit fully before we answer. I want this decided in 1 pass, not 3. The Hearth Fleet held its formation. The old pattern, formation kindling. 47 ships arranged in overlapping fire lanes so dense that no vector into the formation's heart passed through fewer than 6 simultaneous target locks. It had been drilled into 3 generations of crew across 314 years by officers who had never once had the luxury of a second chance to get it right. Refined in the vacuum between dying systems where every mistake cost lives that could not be replaced from any shipyard. Because there was no shipyard. There was only the fleet, and what the fleet could build from asteroid ore and dead moons, and the bones of ships too damaged to save. The Dominion Crescent closed to 100,000 kilometers and opened fire first. It was, Wren would think much later, the single worst tactical decision the Fourth Strike Wing's commander could have made, and he did not live long enough to understand why. 200 ships loosed a coordinated barrage designed to saturate a target area faster than point defense could intercept it. A tactic that worked, reliably, against every enemy the Dominion had ever tested it on. It did not work against the Ember Vigil's escort screen, because the escort screen had been designed by people who had spent 3 centuries assuming that any incoming fire from anyone at any time would be exactly this kind of overwhelming saturation barrage, and had built their defense grids accordingly, layered, redundant, self-correcting, each ship's point defense network cross-linked to every other ship in the formation, so that no single hull ever had to survive an attack alone. 91% of the barrage was intercepted before it crossed the Hearth Fleet's outer defense perimeter. The remaining 9% struck shielding that had been grown, tested, and rebuilt across 300 years of collisions with debris fields, radiation storms, and the occasional desperate pirate who mistook a generation fleet for easy prey. 2 human ships took hull damage. None took critical damage. None lost a single crew member. "Damage report," Josiah Calder said, and his voice was very calm, the calm of a man who had expected exactly this. "Superficial. The Halloway and the Kestrel took hits to secondary armor, both holding at 94% structural integrity. No injuries reported fleet-wide." Wren looked up from the tactical station, and for the first time she let herself feel the thing that had been building under her ribs since the transit alarm, not fear anymore, not even the pointed, useful fear from before, but something closer to grim clarity. "They emptied their opening barrage into us and we're still standing, sir." "Then it's our turn." Josiah Calder's voice did not rise, did not change register at all, and that, Wren thought, was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "Weapons free. Concentrate fire on the Crescent's forward third, collapse their envelopment before it closes. Do not pursue past the collapse point. We are not here to slaughter 200 ships. We are here to break a siege. The Hearth Fleet's return fire did not look like anything in the Dominion's tactical manuals, because it had been built by people with no manuals to follow, only 3 centuries of trial, error, and the specific, unglamorous ingenuity of a species that had learned to manufacture warships out of whatever a dead system happened to have lying around. Railguns forged from salvaged asteroid mining rigs threw slugs at velocities the Dominion's shielding had never been rated to stop, because no one the Dominion had ever fought had needed to hit that hard with something that simple. Point defense turrets doubled as offensive batteries in a crisis, a redundancy born of 300 years without a spare parts supply chain. And beneath all of it, the thing Coram Dass's recon flight had died discovering. A directed pulse in a spectrum, the Dominion sensors barely registered, capable of scrambling a target ship's own systems from the inside before a single physical round ever arrived. The forward third of the 4th Strike Wings Crescent did not so much lose the exchange as cease, in the space of 4 minutes, to function as a coherent formation. 14 ships went dark the way Recon Flight 2 had gone dark. 22 more took hull damage severe enough to force an immediate withdrawal. The rest of the Crescent, seeing its forward edge simply stop responding to command, did the only thing 200 years of Dominion doctrine had ever taught it to do when a formation broke. It scattered, each captain making an individual judgment about survival that had nothing to do with the wing commander's original plan. The 4th Strike Wings commander was among the 14 that went dark in the first 4 minutes. He never transmitted a single word back to Fleet Marshal Ashkel explaining what had happened to him. Ashkel received the outcome as a bare tactical summary, delivered by Vase in a voice that had gone flat with the effort of keeping it steady. 4th Strike Wing engagement concluded, Marshal. We have lost contact with 14 vessels. 22 more report critical damage and are withdrawing under their own power. The remainder have broken formation and are returning to the main line without orders. Say that again. Ashkel's voice had lost its earlier certainty entirely. 200 ships engaged 47, Marshal, and the 47 are still there. All of them. We have not confirmed the loss of a single enemy hull. The command tier was silent for a long moment. Aldrun Hold still hung in the viewport, unchanged, its 4 million lights still burning, still waiting for an ultimatum that had suddenly become a great deal less certain than it had been an hour before. It's not possible, Ashkel said, and Vase understood with a small cold feeling in his chest that the Marshal was no longer speaking as a commander assessing a battlefield. He was speaking as a man trying to argue his way out of a fact that had already happened. 200 warships do not lose to 47 of anything. Recalculate the engagement. There's an error somewhere, a corrupted return, eh? There is no error, Marshal. Vase heard himself say it, and some part of him was surprised at the steadiness of his own voice, because it was the first time in 30 years of cataloging dead civilizations that he had directly contradicted a superior officer to his face. I have reviewed the telemetry twice. The formation we engaged is not a myth, and it is not a lost trading concern, and it did not win by luck. Marshal, I would like to formally recommend we reconsider committing further forces before we understand what we are actually facing. Ashkel turned from the viewport, and for a moment Vase thought he might strike him. Instead, the Marshal simply stood there, hands still folded behind his back, jaw working, staring at a registrar who had just told him, in the politest language available, that the arithmetic he had trusted his entire career was wrong. I have 3,800 warships in this sector, Registrar, Ashkel said finally, very quietly. I did not bring them here to be lectured about caution by a man who spends his life reading about dead people. Signal the main line. All available reserve elements are to consolidate on the blood claims position immediately. We will settle this with numbers large enough that even a myth cannot argue with them. Marshal, if I may, the hold's surrender window. The hold can wait. For the first time, something that was almost fear crossed Ashkel's face, quickly suppressed, replaced by the older, harder mask of a man who had built a career on never admitting he had been wrong about anything. I want that fleet identified, contained, and ended before I explain to Dominion Central why a bedtime story cost me 14 warships in 4 minutes. Aboard the Ember Vigil, the aftermath of the engagement moved fast, the way it always did after a fight, the wounded checked, the damage logged, the small quiet relief of a crew realizing, all at once, that they had survived something they had trained 3 centuries for and never actually expected to face. Wren stood at the tactical station running the after-action numbers and found her hands were, very slightly, shaking, and made herself stop noticing that until she had time to. 14 enemy hulls confirmed neutralized, she reported, 22 withdrawing under damage. No losses on our side, 2 ships with minor hull damage, crew status green fleet-wide. She looked up. Sir, they're not falling back to the hold. Sensors showing the rest of their reserve consolidating, everything they've got in this sector, converging on the blockade line. Josiah Calder studied the plot for a long moment. The same slow, deliberate consideration Wren had watched him give to every hard problem she had ever seen him face. The reactor breach in her 16th year, the debris storm that had nearly cost them the Halloway, the year the recyclers failed, and the whole fleet had eaten reduced rations for 4 months rather than risk a supply run through hostile space. He had never once, in her memory, let a hard number make the decision for him before he had looked at it properly himself. How many total, if they consolidate everything? Preliminary estimate, based on the formation size we're seeing move, somewhere between 2,800 and 3,000 hulls, sir. Possibly more once the outlying elements catch up. Against 47. Against 47. He was quiet again, and this time Wren understood without being told exactly what he was weighing. Not whether they could win. She had watched him do enough of this kind of math across her life to know that, can we win, was rarely the first question he asked. He was weighing what winning would cost, and whether the cost was one the fleet could carry and still be a fleet worth arriving anywhere in, at the end of all this, once they finally found their way home. Signal Aldrune hold, he said finally. Open a channel, tell them who we are and that we intend to break the blockade. I want their warden ready to move civilians the moment we have a gap open, because we are not going to have the luxury of a slow, careful liberation. This is going to be fast and it is going to be ugly, and I want their people ready to run the second we tell them to. He turned to Wren, and something in his face had settled, the last of the deliberation resolving into the flat, immovable certainty she had grown up trusting more than almost anything else in her life. Signal the fleet. We're not waiting for them to finish consolidating. We hit the blockade ring now, while it's still 600 ships instead of 3,000, and we open a door for that moon before the rest of their strength arrives to close it. Yes, sir. Wren's hands had stopped shaking. There was no room left for it. Recommend I take the strike group in first, 9 ships, fast profile, punch the ring at its thinnest point before the main line follows through the gap. Her grandfather looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his expression that was not quite a father's fear and not quite a commander's calculation, but some third thing built from both. You'd be leading it yourself. Somebody has to, sir. Might as well be someone who's actually run the simulations for it. You've run Formation Kindling's breach variant. You haven't run it live, against a live enemy, with real people's lives on the other end of every decision you make in the next 10 minutes. No, sir. Neither had you the first time. Wren held his gaze, and she felt, standing there, the specific weight of being her great-grandmother's blood and her grandfather's student, and for the next 10 minutes, the officer whose call it would be whether 9 ships and their crews lived or died. The oath doesn't come with an asterisk for people who have never done it before, either. Josiah Calder looked at her for a long moment, and something that was almost pride and almost grief moved behind his eyes, gone before Wren could be sure she'd seen it. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. Take the strike group, Lieutenant Commander. Punch the ring. I'll bring the main line through behind you the moment you open the gap." "Yes, sir." She was already moving toward the launch bay before the order had fully finished leaving his mouth, 9 ships worth of crew falling in around her, and behind her, on the command deck of the Ember Vigil, Admiral Josiah Calder watched his granddaughter go and did not let himself think, even once, about how much of the kindling oath's cost had always, eventually, come due in exactly this kind of moment. Someone's child at the front of the formation, carrying the fire because someone had to. And it might as well be someone who had actually run the numbers. The blockade ring around Aldrun Hold was 600 ships thick in places, thin in others, and Wren had spent the transit out from the Ember Vigil finding the thin place, a seam on the Hold's trailing hemisphere where the Dominion had stretched its picket line to cover the debris field left over from the relief convoy's destruction, on the assumption that no one would be foolish enough to fly a strike group through a field of wreckage at speed. She flew her 9 ships through the wreckage field at speed. Her flagship for the run was the Cutwater, a low-slung gunship a third the size of the Ember Vigil, built for exactly this kind of work, fast, hard to hit, carrying enough forward armament to make a hole and enough armor to survive making it. Ensign Idris Farrow rode the gunnery station behind her, 22 years old, voyage-born like she was, a friend since before either of them could remember not being friends. His hands steady on the fire controls in a way Wren found herself grateful for every time she glanced at the readout, and saw his targeting solutions already 3 steps ahead of where the tactical plot said the enemy would be in 6 seconds. 40 seconds to the seam, Idris said. They're reading us on approach. 2 picket cruisers moving to intercept. Let them move. Wren's eyes were on the debris field ahead, a slow, tumbling wreckage of hull plating and cargo containers and things she made herself not look at too closely, because the relief convoy that had died here 3 weeks ago had been carrying people, and there was no time, not now, to feel anything about that except the specific, useful anger it put behind her hands on the controls. 9 ships against 2 cruisers is not a fair fight for them. Idris put the first shots into their forward, shielding the second were in range. I want that seam wide open before the rest of the ring can react. The 2 Dominion picket cruisers turned out to be exactly as outmatched as Wren had calculated, and exactly as unprepared for it as the 4th strike wing had been 3 hours earlier, because word of what had happened to the 4th strike wing had not yet reached the picket line, and would not reach it before it was too late to matter. The Cutwater and her 8 escorts tore through the seam in 90 seconds, railgun slugs and directed pulses opening a corridor through the wreckage field and the picket line both. And behind them, the gap they cut stayed open, because there was nothing left on either side of it capable of closing it fast enough. Gap confirmed, 40 kilometers wide and holding, Idris reported. Signal the Ember Vigil. Signal them. Tell my grandfather the door's open. Wren allowed herself exactly 1 breath of something like relief before the tactical plot updated again and the relief evaporated. And tell him to hurry. The rest of the ring's waking up. It was waking up fast. 600 ships was a great deal of firepower even scattered thin around a besieged moon, and once the alarm reached every picket captain in the formation, the Dominion response came not as a single coordinated maneuver, but as dozens of individual ships peeling off from their stations to converge on the gap Wren's strike group had just cut, each captain making the same instinctive calculation: close the breach, contain the intrusion, prevent whatever was coming through from reaching the hold. What was coming through was the rest of the Hearth Fleet, 38 warships in formation Kindling's breach variant, and it came through the gap 40 seconds after Wren's signal reached the Ember Vigil, moving with the same unhurried, methodical certainty that had characterized every decision the fleet had made since transit. Not fast because fast was reckless, but fast enough, exactly fast enough. Because 300 years of deep dark had taught this fleet that the space between reckless and too slow was where most of its dead had come from. The battle that followed did not look, from the perspective of any single Dominion captain caught in it, like a battle at all. It looked like a slow-motion catastrophe, happening to people who had made a series of individually reasonable decisions that had, in aggregate, put them in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. Wren's strike group held the gap open from the inside, picking off any picket cruiser that came close enough to threaten the corridor, while the main line pushed through behind her and fanned out along the hold's trailing hemisphere, engaging the blockade ring's converging elements piecemeal, never letting more than a fraction of the 600 ships bring coordinated fire to bear at once. 14 minutes, Josiah Calder said, watching the plot from the Ember Vigil's command deck as the numbers updated, ship by ship, in a steady grim rhythm that had nothing celebratory in it at all. 14 minutes and the ring's broken on this hemisphere. Signal Aldrune hold, tell the warden we have a corridor, and it will not stay open forever. Move your people now. Warden Bellick Thrase's answer, when it came, carried the specific rasp of a voice that had spent 19 days giving orders under siege and had not slept properly in most of them. This is Aldrune hold. We hear you, Ember Vigil, and gods, we don't know who you are, but we hear you. Evacuation convoys launching now. We have 40,000 souls in the first wave, more to follow. If that corridor closes before. It will not close, Josiah Calder said, and something in his voice made even Wren, hearing it relayed across the tactical channel from the front of the breach, believe him completely. Move your people, Warden, we'll hold the door. They held the door for 51 minutes, which was longer than Wren had planned for, and exactly as long as it took the last evacuation convoy to clear the hold's gravity well and vanish into the safety of the Hearth Fleet's rear formation. 51 minutes of a fight that never stopped moving, never let the Dominion's numbers organize into anything more dangerous than a series of local defeats, each one bleeding another handful of ships out of the 600 that had, less than a day earlier, looked to Fleet-Marshal Ashkell like an arithmetic problem with the answer already known. It was in the 38th minute that the Ember Vigil took the hit that put Josiah Calder on the deck. It was not a lucky shot, exactly. The Dominion cruiser that fired it had simply found, for one moment, a firing solution through a gap in the escort screen that no amount of 300-year-old doctrine could have closed fast enough. A single heavy round striking the command tier's outer hull hard enough to buckle a support strut 2 decks below where Josiah Calder was standing. The strut gave. The deck plating above it did not hold. Wren heard the report come across the tactical channel in the strike group's own voice, flat and controlled, the way every voice on this fleet had been trained to stay controlled no matter what it was reporting, and felt something in her chest go very cold and very still. Command deck reports Admiral Calder down. Structural collapse, deck 7. Medical is responding. Command authority transfers to a pause. The specific pause of an officer checking a protocol list that had never, in 300 years, actually needed to be used in the field. Lieutenant Commander Calder, Tactical Command, currently forward with the strike group. For exactly 1 second, Wren Calder stood very still at the Cutwater's tactical station, and the universe narrowed down to the size of that word down, and the specific, unbearable ordinariness of the voice that had said it, as if her grandfather being carried out from under a collapsed deck plate were just one more line item in a battle that had a great many other line items still open and unresolved. Then Idris Pharaoh's voice cut through it, low and steady beside her. Wren. The fleet needs an order. She made herself breathe. She made herself look at the tactical plot instead of at the sick, cold place in her chest where the word down was still sitting, and she found, when she looked, that the plot had not changed just because the man who had commanded this fleet across 300 years of deep dark was currently being carried to a medical bay by 2 crew members who did not yet know whether he would live. The gap was still open. The evacuation convoys were still running. 31 Dominion ships were still converging on a weak point in the trailing formation's southern arc, and somebody had to decide in the next 4 seconds what the fleet did about it. She decided. Southern arc, redirect the Kestrel and the Halloway to reinforce, concentrate fire on the lead cruisers before the rest of that group can close. Her voice did not shake. She would think much later that this was the single thing she was proudest of in the entire day, not the tactics, not the breach, not any of it, but the fact that in the worst 4 seconds of her life, her voice had not shaken. All strike group elements hold the corridor. Nobody breaks formation until the last convoy clears the well. That is still the mission. That has not changed. Copy, Lieutenant Commander. Idris's hands were already moving on the gunnery controls, and somewhere behind that steady professional calm, Wren heard the thing he was not saying, the same thing every voice on the channel was carefully, deliberately not saying, because there was no room for it yet. Kestrel and Halloway redirecting. Corridor holding. Wren Calder held command of the Hearth Fleet, 24 years old, voyage-born, having never once in her life set foot on the world she was fighting to reach. For the next 13 minutes, while her grandfather lay in the Ember Vigil's medical bay with a chest full of broken ribs and a surgeon working fast to stop internal bleeding, and did not lose a single ship, and did not let the corridor close, and did not even once let herself think about anything except the next right decision, the way he had taught her a person survived the long dark, not by refusing to be afraid, but by refusing to let the fear drive. The last evacuation convoy cleared Aldrune holds gravity well in the 51st minute. Warden Thrace's voice came back across the channel a moment later, rough with something that was not quite relief yet, because relief required time the warden did not have to spend on it. Last convoy clear. Ember Vigil, whoever's holding that door right now, you have our world's thanks, whatever that's worth against however many of them are still out there. It's worth everything, Warden, Wren said, and meant it, and did not have time to say anything more, because the tactical plot had just updated with a new formation resolving out of the hold's far orbital shadow. The rest of the Second Correction Fleet, consolidated at last, nearly 3,000 warships strong, arriving exactly where Fleet-Marshal Ashkell had ordered them to arrive, exactly as late as 3,000 ships moving across 40 light minutes of the Amrith Verge could be expected to be. Corridors held, Idris said quietly, watching the new formation resolve. Wren, that's the whole rest of it. That's everything they've got. Wren looked at the number, 2,800, near enough, arrayed across the hold's far orbital shadow like a wall built to answer an insult, and felt, for the first time since the word down had knocked the breath out of her chest, something that was not quite fear and not quite fury, but the specific, steady clarity her grandfather had spent her whole life teaching her to find in exactly this kind of moment. Then it's a good thing, she said, that we came out here with more than 47 ships worth of reasons to still be standing when they arrived. She opened the fleet-wide channel, her voice carrying now to every hull in the Hearth Fleet, the exhausted strike group holding the corridor, the main line still engaged along the hold's trailing hemisphere, the reserve element still catching up from the rear of the formation, and somewhere below all of it, 40,000 rescued souls and a warden who had just watched a myth save his world. This is Lieutenant Commander Calder holding tactical command of the Hearth Fleet. The hold is clear, the convoy's out. And in about 31 minutes we are going to have company. She paused and found in that pause the specific steadiness that was the only inheritance she had ever really needed from either of the women who had come before her, the one who had written the oath, and the one, lying broken and unconscious 400 meters aft of the Ember Vigil's command deck, who had spent his whole life keeping it. Formation kindling, full pattern. We hold this line, the same way we've held every line for 314 years. Together and all the way through. Fleet Marshal Ashkel stood on the Bloodclaim's command tier and watched the tactical plot resolve his entire committed strength into a single formation, 2,840 warships arrayed across the hold's far orbital shadow, and told himself that this, finally, was an arithmetic problem large enough that no amount of impossible engineering on the other side could argue with it. He did not entirely believe himself. He noticed that and hated it, and pushed the noticing down where it could not interfere with the next hour. "Casualties from the blockade engagement," he said to Vase without looking away from the plot. "Final count. 211 ships lost or disabled, Marshal. The hold's evacuation is complete. We have confirmed 40,000 civilians extracted, likely more we have not yet confirmed. The enemy formation has not lost a single hull across the entire engagement." Vase's voice had gone past flat into something almost hollow, the sound of a man reciting numbers he had checked 4 times, because he did not trust himself to have read them correctly the first 3. "Marshal, I have pulled the full text of the vanished kin cycle from the archive while we waited for the reserve to consolidate. I think you should hear it before we commit 2,800 ships to this." Ashkel's jaw worked. "Read it." Vase read from the slate, his voice steadying as he found the rhythm of a text he had studied for 30 years and never once expected to need operationally. "When the fire dims and the hearth grows cold, do not mistake the ash for the ember beneath it. The kin did not die in the dark. They built in it. And when the fire returns, it will not ask whether you remember its name before it burns what you have built on the assumption that it never would." He set the slate down. "It's not a cautionary tale about hubris, Marshal. I misread the classification 30 years ago, and I misread it again this morning. It's a warning. Someone 3 centuries ago watched this fleet leave and understood exactly what would eventually come back. A myth doesn't win battles, Registrar." Ashkel's voice had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a man holding onto the last plank of a position he could feel disintegrating under him. "Discipline wins battles. Numbers win battles. I have 2,800 ships and they have 47. Whatever they built out there in the dark, it is still 47 hulls, and 47 hulls cannot be everywhere at once." "No," Vase agreed quietly. "But I would ask you to consider, Marshal, that they have spent 314 years learning exactly where everywhere is going to be." Ashkel did not answer that. He gave the order instead, full commitment, all 2,800 warships, a single overwhelming advance designed to envelop the entire Hearth Fleet at once rather than repeat the 4th Strike Wing's mistake of engaging piecemeal. It was, by any doctrine the Dominion had ever written, the correct decision. It was also, though no one on the Bloodclaim's command tier yet understood this, exactly the decision that Josiah Calder, awake now, gray-faced, refusing the surgeon's order to stay under sedation, propped upright in the Ember Vigil's medical bay with a data feed patched in from the command deck, had spent the last 20 minutes hoping the Marshal would make. "They're committing everything," Josiah Calder said, watching the plot from a cot he was not supposed to be watching anything from. "Good. That's the mistake that ends this today instead of dragging it out over a dozen more engagements." "Sir, you should be resting," the surgeon said for the 3rd time, and got, for the 3rd time, the same flat look that had made 300 years of crew members learn not to argue with Josiah Calder about anything he had already decided. "I'll rest when the fleet's safe. Get me a channel to tactical command." The channel opened, and Wren's voice came through it, tired but steady, still holding the Cutwater's tactical station at the front of a formation that had not slept in over 16 hours. "Admiral, good to hear your voice, sir. Medical cleared you for a channel." "Medical did not clear me for anything. I overruled medical." A pause, and something in it that Wren recognized instantly, the specific dry note her grandfather used when he was choosing not to say how frightened he had been about something. You've had command for 4 hours and you haven't lost a ship. I'd say that settles the question of whether you were ready. I had good teachers, sir. You had one good teacher and a great deal of your own stubbornness. Don't undersell yourself. He shifted against the cot, and Wren heard the sharp intake of breath he tried to hide, and filed it away with the rest of the things she would let herself feel later, once this was over. Report. What are we looking at? 2,840 ships, full commitment, single envelopment formation. They've learned not to split their forces, they're coming as one mass, all axes at once. Wren studied the plot, and something in the shape of it caught her attention, the way a familiar problem catches attention even in an unfamiliar scale. Sir, this is formation kindling's own logic turned against us. They're trying to do to us exactly what we did to the 4th Strike Wing. Deny us a soft flank by not giving us a formation with a gap in it. Does it work? Wren studied the numbers a moment longer, running the same slow, deliberate consideration she had watched her grandfather give every hard problem of her life, and found, at the end of it, the answer that 314 years of the kindling oath had built this fleet to find. No, sir, it doesn't, because they're still thinking about this as a problem of surface area. How much of us can they hit at once? We've never fought a battle where surface area was the deciding factor. We've fought 3 centuries of battles where the deciding factor was who could keep functioning as one formation the longest, under the worst conditions, with the least room for error. That's not a numbers game. That's an endurance game. And sir, we've had 314 years of practice at enduring things that should have killed us. There was a silence on the channel, and when Josiah Calder spoke again, his voice had the particular roughness in it that Wren had heard exactly twice before in her life. Once when her grandmother died, and once, years earlier than that, on the anniversary of the day the Long Dark had forced the launch, when he had told her, for the first time, the full story of the 12 fragile arcs and the 600 people who had not made it aboard before the doors sealed. Your great-grandmother would be proud of that answer, he said. I am proud of that answer. Hold the line, Lieutenant Commander. Bring the fleet home. Yes, sir. Wren cut the channel and turned back to the tactical plot, and to Idris Pharaoh's steady presence at the gunnery station beside her, and to the slow, terrible, beautiful shape of 2,840 warships closing on a formation of 47 that had already, 3 centuries ago, decided it would rather die learning to endure than live having never tried. All hands, she said, opening the fleet-wide channel one more time, her voice carrying now across every hull in the Hearth Fleet, the strike group, the main line. The reserve elements finally caught up and folded into the formation. 400 meters of steel and salvage, and 300 years of stubborn survival arrayed against a wall of enemy hulls that stretched from one edge of the tactical plot to the other. This is Lieutenant Commander Calder. They've sent everything they have. That means there is nothing left behind them for us to worry about once this is finished. Formation kindling, full pattern, full commitment. Nobody is coming to save Aldrune Hold if we don't. Nobody is coming to save us either if it comes to that. We've known that for 314 years, and we've never once let it stop us. Hold the line. Hold each other. Let's finish this. Across the tactical plot, 47 human warships tightened their formation into the oldest pattern any of them knew, and 2,840 Dominion warships began their final approach, and somewhere behind them all, Outpost 6 Ril's Ensign Dal Ray, reassigned 3 hours earlier to the Bloodclaim's own analysis deck on Vace's direct order. Because a man who had correctly called this threat twice, while everyone around him called it a ghost story, had earned a seat closer to the decision-making, watched the 2 formations close on the plot and found himself, quietly, hoping for an outcome that no loyal officer of the Dominion should have been hoping for. The 2 formations closed across 9 minutes of building silence, and it was Idris Pharaoh who broke it first, his voice pitched low, and even the way it always was in the last seconds before a fight. a habit Wren had learned to find steadying rather than strange somewhere over the last 2 decades of knowing him. Range in 30 seconds. They're not slowing the approach. Full commitment, just like the plot said. He glanced sideways at her just once. Wren, however this goes, good work today. Your grandfather's right. You didn't need a teacher standing over your shoulder for any of it. Save it for after, she said, but she meant the words underneath it, and he heard them and nodded and turned back to the gunnery controls. The Dominion advance struck the Hearth Fleet's formation at the 12-minute mark, and for the first 90 seconds it looked, from a distance, almost like the numbers should have suggested it would, 2,800 ships bringing fire to bear from every angle at once, the tactical plot lighting up with so many simultaneous engagement markers that the display software struggled to render them cleanly. Then the 90 seconds ended, and the shape of the battle revealed itself as something else entirely. Formation kindling did not try to win the exchange of fire. It tried to survive it methodically, one interception at a time, every ship's defense grid cross-linked to every other ship's, absorbing a barrage that would have broken any conventional formation in the first 30 seconds and simply refusing, hull by hull, system by system, to stop functioning. A cruiser took damage that should have crippled it and kept its point defense grid running on backup power routed from 3 other ships' reserves. A gunship lost its primary weapons battery and immediately became a relay node, feeding targeting data to 6 other hulls instead. Nothing on the human side broke, because nothing on the human side had been built with the assumption that breaking was survivable. 3 centuries without a shipyard had taught this fleet that every hull had to be the last line of defense for every other hull, because there was no reserve fleet waiting behind them, no home port to retreat to, nothing but the 47 ships and each other. "Report," Wren said 4 minutes in, her voice steady over the growing static of 100 simultaneous engagements. "Holding," Idris said. "We are holding, Wren. 93% interception rate fleet-wide, no losses." "Enemy losses." He checked the number, checked it again. "Enemy losses at 180 confirmed 4 minutes in." Aboard the Bloodclaim, Fleet Marshal Ashkel watched the same number resolve on his own tactical plot, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a word for yet, because he had never before needed a word for watching an equation he trusted dissolve in real time. 180 ships, 4 minutes. He said it aloud, testing the words, the way he had tested Vase's first report that morning, except this time there was no ice to test it against, only the certainty that the number was correct and would keep growing. Concentrate all fire on their flagship. If we can't win the exchange, we end it by removing whoever's directing it. "Marshal, their command structure isn't centralized the way ours is," Vase said, watching his own console with the specific horror of a man watching a theory he had dismissed that morning prove itself true in real time. "Every hull in that formation is operating with enough autonomy to function if the flagship goes dark. We saw it with the 4th Strike Wing. They didn't need their commander to keep fighting effectively. This fleet may not either. Then we remove enough of them that autonomy stops mattering." Ashkel's voice had lost every trace of the certainty it had carried that morning, replaced by something harder and more desperate, the voice of a man who has run out of good options and is now simply choosing among bad ones. "All ships, full commitment, no reserve, no withdrawal authorization. We break this formation or we die trying, because I am not explaining a retreat from 47 ships to Dominion Central." The battle ground on, minute by minute, each one adding its own grim arithmetic to the plot. 240 enemy hulls lost by the 7-minute mark, 310 by the 11th. The Hearth Fleet's own losses climbing too now as the sheer volume of incoming fire began, slowly, to find the seams even 3 centuries of engineering could not fully close. The gunship Halloway, already damaged from the blockade engagement, took a concentrated strike from 6 Dominion cruisers at once and went dark in the 18th minute, not destroyed. Wren would learn later, but crippled badly enough to drift out of formation, her crew fighting a desperate battle of their own just to keep atmosphere in the hull, while 3 other human ships broke pattern to screen her from further fire. It was the first ship the Hearth Fleet had lost from the formation in over 300 years of recorded engagements, and Wren felt the loss of it. Not the ship, not yet. The crew was still alive, still fighting, but the loss of the perfect unbroken record landed in her chest like a physical blow. "Holloway's out of the line," Idris reported. "Cross and Meridian screening her. She's not dark, Wren, her crew's still fighting, but she can't hold formation. Get me a channel to her captain." The channel opened to a voice ragged with smoke and effort, the sound of a crew fighting a fire in a hull that had just taken more damage in 18 minutes than in the previous 3 centuries combined. "Cutwater, this is Holloway. We're not out of it. Hull's breached in 4 compartments, we've got it sealed. Engines are down to 40%, but we are still shooting. Holloway, hold position, let Cross and Meridian screen you. You've done enough for today." "With respect, Lieutenant Commander," the voice cracked, steadied, "we haven't. Not until that moon's people are safe for good, not just today. Give us a target. We can still shoot." Wren felt something tighten in her throat that had nothing to do with tactics, and gave the Holloway a target, because refusing would have been its own kind of insult to a crew that had earned the right to keep fighting on their own terms. The battle ground on. 23 minutes in, the Dominion's losses passed 600 ships, more than the entire original blockade force that had ringed Aldrune Hold that morning. And still, the mass of the Second Correction Fleet kept coming, because Fleet-Marshal Ashkell had given an order with no withdrawal authorization attached to it. And 3 centuries of Dominion doctrine had never once trained a captain to disobey a direct order from a fleet marshal. Even when every instrument on his own bridge was screaming that the order was going to get him killed. One of those captains was a young cruiser commander named Orson Kett, 24th in his family line to serve the Dominion fleet, who had entered the engagement believing, along with every other officer under Ashkell's command, that 2,800 ships against 47 was not a battle so much as a formality that happened to involve weapons fire. He had watched that certainty die in stages over 23 minutes, first in the calm, unhurried way the human formation had absorbed his opening barrage without so much as a ripple in its structure, then in the sight of his own squadron mates going dark one by one on the tactical plot with no visible cause he could name, and finally, in the last minute before his own cruiser took the strike that would end it, in the simple, plain fact that he had run every targeting solution his ship was capable of running, and had not once, in 23 minutes, managed to land a shot that mattered. He died believing, with total and hard-won clarity, that the story his own grandmother had told him as a child had been true in every detail except the one that mattered most, that the fire in the dark had never gone out, and had simply been waiting all this time for someone foolish enough to test whether it had. At the 26-minute mark, Wren made the decision she had been holding in reserve since the formations first closed, the decision that had been waiting, unused, in the Ember Vigil's forward weapons bay for 314 years. A weapon built not from any single technology the fleet had carried out of the dying solar system, but from decades of patient, dangerous salvage in a stretch of dead space the fleet's engineers had come to call the Cinder Deep, where the collapsed core matter of an extinguished star had been harvested, refined, and slowly, over 2 full generations, forged into a single spinal-mounted cannon. The fleet had never once, in 300 years, needed to fire in anger. They called it the Anvil Lance, and it had a recharge cycle of 6 hours and a single shot's worth of ready capacity, and Wren had been saving it, without quite admitting to herself that she was saving it, for exactly the moment when nothing else would be enough. "Ember Vigil, this is Cutwater," she said, opening a direct channel to the flagship, where her grandfather, against every order the surgeon had given him, was sitting upright in the medical bay watching the battle unfold on a patched-in feed. Request authorization to fire the lance. Target the blood claim directly. If we take out their flagship and enough of the mass behind it in one strike, this ends in the next 5 minutes instead of dragging out until we lose ships we can't afford to lose. There was a pause on the channel, and Wren understood in the silence exactly what her grandfather was weighing. Not whether the lance would work. She had run those numbers 100 times over 300 years of drills, but whether firing a weapon that powerful, that final, was the kind of thing the kindling oath had ever intended this fleet to become. Authorization granted, Josiah Calder said finally, his voice rough but certain. Fire it, Lieutenant Commander. And this. The Anvil lance took 40 seconds to charge from ready standby to full discharge, and Wren spent every one of those 40 seconds watching the Ember Vigil's spinal mount light up on the tactical plot, a slow bloom of gathering energy visible even at this range, bright enough that 3 separate Dominion captains broke off their own engagements to redirect fire toward it, sensing correctly, too late, that whatever was building in that light was the single most dangerous thing on the battlefield. 40 seconds isn't going to be enough, Idris said, watching the same plot, watching 6 Dominion cruisers converge on the Ember Vigil's position with everything they had left. Wren, the flagship's going to take fire before that thing finishes charging. Then we don't let it. Wren was already moving, redirecting the strike group's remaining 8 ships into a screening formation between the Ember Vigil and the converging cruisers, the Cutwater taking point, every gun she had left in front of the one weapon that could end this in a single stroke. All strike group elements converge on the flagship's position. Nothing gets through. Nothing. Not for 40 seconds. They held for 40 seconds. It cost the strike group the Meridian, which took a strike meant for the Ember Vigil's exposed flank and absorbed it whole, her crew of 41 souls gone in a single silent flash on the tactical plot that Wren would carry with her, unspoken, for the rest of her life. The second ship the Hearth Fleet had lost in 314 years, and the first it had lost outright, and she filed the grief for it in the same place she had filed everything else that day, to be felt properly later. Because there were still 6 seconds left on the charge cycle, and the fleet needed her steady for every one of them. The Anvil lance fired at the 27-minute mark. It did not look like the weapons Fleet-Marshal Ashkel's officers had trained their entire careers to recognize as dangerous. No visible barrage, no spread of interceptable fire, just a single line of light lancing out from the Ember Vigil's bow, so bright and so brief that half the sensor operators watching it on both sides of the battle would later report they were not entirely certain they had seen it at all, only that the blood claim had been there, whole and firing, and then it was not. The strike passed through the blood claim's hull, through 6 ships arrayed behind her in close formation, and out the far side of the engagement entirely, a wound cut clean through the heart of the Dominion's command structure in less than a second. And in the silence that followed, a silence that lasted, on the Dominion side of the battle, for nearly 11 full seconds before any surviving officer found the composure to issue an order, the arithmetic of the entire engagement changed at once. Fleet Marshal Voren Ashkel survived the strike. This was, later, the detail that Vase would find himself least able to explain to Dominion Central, because by every principle of tactical logic he had spent 30 years studying, the Marshal should not have. The Anvil lance had passed through the blood claim's command tier close enough that Ashkel felt the heat of it through the deck plating, close enough that 3 officers standing within arm's reach of him did not survive it, and he was left standing at the shattered viewport of a flagship that was, in every sense that mattered, no longer a functioning warship, looking out at Aldrune Hold's lights, and at a tactical plot that had just told him, in language even he could no longer argue with, that the war he had come here to win was already lost. Marshal, Vase's voice when it came, was barely audible over the emergency klaxons and the hiss of atmosphere venting from a hull breached 2 decks below. Marshal, we have lost command and control across the formation. 60% of the fleet is either destroyed or has broken contact without orders. The rest are martial, they're routing. Ships are disengaging on their own authority all across the formation. Ashkel did not answer immediately. He stood at the broken viewport, one hand pressed against a support strut that had buckled but not yet failed, and looked out at a battlefield that 11 hours ago had looked to him like an arithmetic problem with the answer already known. "How many," he said finally, "how many ships do we have left out of everything we brought?" Vase checked the number, and checked it again, because it was the kind of number a man checked twice before he said it aloud to a superior officer whose entire career had just ended in front of him. 380, Marshal. Out of 3,440 committed to this engagement, including the original blockade force. 380 ships remain combat capable, and most of those are already disengaging. 380 out of 3,440. Ashkel did the arithmetic without wanting to, the way you cannot stop yourself from finishing a sentence you already know the ending of, and found that it did not comfort him at all to have finally solved the problem correctly, because the correct answer was worse than any wrong one he had been willing to imagine that morning. Aboard the Cutwater, the tactical plot told the same story from the other direction, and Ren Calder watched 2,800 ships collapse into 380 fleeing hulls with a feeling that was not triumph. Not really. Not with the Meridian's 41 names already sitting cold and unspoken in her chest, but something closer to the specific, exhausted relief of a person who has just watched the worst thing they were afraid of not happen. "They're breaking," Idris said. "Ren, they're breaking." "It's over." "Not yet." Ren's eyes were on the plot, on the 380 ships scattering toward the edge of the engagement zone, and on one signal in particular, a single Dominion hull, badly damaged, broadcasting on an open channel that had not been used for anything but tactical coordination all day. That's the blood claim. Their flagship. It's still transmitting, and it's not transmitting orders, it's transmitting on a wide broadcast band. They're sending something out, and it's not aimed at their own fleet. She was right. Fleet-Marshal Voren Ashkel, standing in the wreckage of his own command tier with 300 years of Dominion certainty in ashes around him, had just made the only decision left available to a man who had run out of every other option. He had ordered Vase to open the Bloodclaim's long-range transmitter, the one reserved for messages meant to reach Dominion Central itself, 40 light-years distant, and he was recording a report that no fleet marshal in Dominion history had ever had to send. "This is Fleet Marshal Voren Ashkel, 2nd Correction Fleet, transmitting from the Amrith Verge." His voice, when he finally spoke, had none of the certainty it had carried at the beginning of the day, and all of the weight of a man choosing, deliberately, to tell a truth that would end his career, because the alternative was letting Dominion Central walk blind into the same mistake he had just made. "This transmission is a warning, and I am recording it myself so that no one has the option of softening it before it reaches Central. The species cataloged in our archive as the vanished kin, designated human, presumed extinct, dismissed for 300 years as a mythological cautionary tale, is not extinct. It is not a myth. It is a fleet of 47 warships, built across 3 centuries in deep space with no shipyard and no resupply, and it has just destroyed 3,060 vessels of the 2nd Correction Fleet in under 30 minutes. He paused, and in the pause, Vase heard something that had not been in the Marshal's voice at any other point in the entire campaign. Not defeat exactly, but the specific, hard-won clarity of a man who has finally, completely, stopped arguing with a fact. "I do not know how many more of them exist beyond the Amrith Verge, or where they are bound, or what they intend once they arrive. I know that whatever story we have been telling ourselves about them for 3 centuries was wrong, and I know that whoever hears this transmission owes it to every fleet they will ever send against this species to hear that warning before they repeat my mistake. Ashkel, out." He closed the channel and stood for a long moment at the shattered viewport, watching Aldrune hold lights burn steady and unbothered in the dark. 40,000 rescued civilians safe in the Hearth Fleet's rear formation. 380 broken ships, all that remained of the largest force the Dominion had committed to a border action in a generation. "Marshal," Vase said quietly, "the human formation is not pursuing. They've held position at the edge of the engagement zone. I don't think they intend to finish us." Ashkel looked out at the tactical plot, at 47 ships holding steady where they had held steady all day, not advancing, not retreating, simply present, the way a fact is present once you have finally stopped being able to argue with it. "No," he said slowly, "I don't think they do either, and I think that frightens me more than if they had." On the cutwater, Wren watched the blood claims transmission register as complete, watched the remnant of the Second Correction Fleet begin its slow, ragged withdrawal toward the edge of the Amrith Verge, and made the call that her grandfather, watching from his cot on the Ember Vigil with a feed patched in and a chest full of broken ribs, had already guessed she would make before she made it. "Let them go," she said to the fleet-wide channel, to every exhausted crew still holding formation after 27 minutes that had felt like a great deal longer. "All units hold position. Do not pursue. We came out here to break a siege, not to hunt down every ship that ran from us. Let them carry the story home. It'll do more work than we could." The work that followed the battle was slower than the battle itself, and in its own way harder, because it was the work of counting what the day had cost instead of simply surviving it. The Halloway limped back into formation under her own power an hour after the blood claims transmission went out, her hull scorched black across 4 compartments, her crew exhausted and soot-streaked, and every one of them alive. Wren met the Halloway's captain in person for the first time that day when the gunship finally docked with the Ember Vigil for repairs. A woman named Priya Akanjo, who had run 3 centuries of family history through a service record that included 2 great-grandparents on the original launch manifest, and who saluted Wren with a hand that was still shaking slightly from adrenaline and said only, "Good orders, Lieutenant Commander." Before her knees nearly buckled, and 2 of her own crew caught her under the arms. The Meridian's dead were harder. 41 names, read aloud on the Ember Vigil's command deck in the old ceremony. The one Wren had only ever seen performed twice in her life, both times for accidents, never before for a battle, while every ship in the fleet that could spare the power ran its running lights to full brightness for the length of the reading. A silent, fleet-wide vigil for people most of the crew had never met, but all of them understood completely, could have been any of them on any day. Doing exactly what the oath asked. Wren read the last name herself, because tradition held that the officer who gave the order that cost the lives carried the weight of saying so aloud, and she did not let her voice shake, though it cost her more than anything else that entire day to keep it steady. Admiral Josiah Calder left the medical bay against direct orders 4 hours after the battle ended, moving slowly, one hand pressed to a chest full of mending ribs, and made his way to the command deck in time to be there, upright and in uniform despite the surgeon's furious objections, when Warden Bellick Thrase's shuttle came alongside the Ember Vigil to meet, in person, the fleet that had broken a siege no one on Aldrune Hold had believed could be broken. Thrase was old for his species, weathered in a way that Wren recognized instinctively even across the gulf of an entirely different biology, the specific tiredness of someone who has spent 19 days making decisions he never expected to have to make. And he stood in the Ember Vigil's forward bay looking up at Josiah Calder with an expression that had not fully settled yet on gratitude, because gratitude required believing the danger was over. And 19 days of siege had taught him not to believe that easily. "You came from nowhere," Thrase said. "Our own registries have nothing on your species. The Dominions had nothing either until today, nothing but a story they used to frighten children." He looked past Josiah Calder to the crew arrayed behind him on the deck, dozens of them, exhausted, soot-streaked, some of them clearly no older than Wren, and something in his face shifted slowly toward the thing it had been holding back. I don't understand who you are or why you came or what it cost you to come. I only know that 4 million of my people are alive tonight who would not have been by morning, and that is a debt I do not know how to begin repaying. You don't owe us anything, Warden. Josiah Calder's voice was rougher than usual, worn down by the day, but steady, the same steadiness Wren had built her entire life around. 314 years ago, my grandmother wrote down a promise before she'd ever met a single living soul outside our own species, because she believed that whoever we eventually found out here, if they were worth finding, would be worth helping whether or not it was convenient. We didn't come here to collect a debt. We came here because the promise didn't come with a clause that said only if it's easy. Thrace was quiet for a long moment, looking at the old man in front of him, at the granddaughter standing a half-step behind his shoulder with tired eyes and a uniform still marked with the day's grime, and at the 47 scarred, salvage-built warships holding formation beyond the viewport, the largest fleet the Amrith Verge had ever seen, and the smallest force to have ever broken a Dominion siege in the history of the sector. Then let me at least offer what I can, he said finally. Aldrun Hold has resources, refined ore, fabrication yards, 3 centuries of trade goods you may have never even had the chance to encounter. If your fleet needs to repair, resupply, or simply rest somewhere that will not ask you for anything more than your company, you have a harbor here for as long as you need one. He paused, and something almost wry crossed his tired face. It is the least a myth deserves, for turning out to be real at exactly the moment we needed it to. Below them, on Aldrun Hold itself, the news had already begun to spread through a population that had spent 19 days bracing for the worst outcome a siege could offer, and had instead, without warning, without any prior knowledge that such a thing was even possible, been saved by a species their own histories had never once recorded meeting. In the makeshift shelters where families had huddled through the worst of the bombardment, in the fabrication yards where workers had spent 19 days converting every available system into emergency defense hardware that had never actually been needed, in the streets where 4 million people were beginning, slowly, to understand that the sky above them no longer held an executioner's countdown. The same question moved from mouth to mouth in a dozen different languages. Who were they? The ones who had appeared from nowhere with no name in any registry and broken an armada in less time than it took most people to eat a meal. No one on Aldrun Hold had an answer yet. But across the Amrith Verge, and soon across a great deal more of the galaxy than that, the answer was already beginning to travel, carried not by the Hearth Fleet, which had no interest in broadcasting its own legend, but by 380 broken Dominion ships limping home with a transmission already burned into every archive they passed through, and by a registrar named Ilan Vase who had spent 30 years cataloging the myths of dead civilizations and had just watched one of them prove, conclusively and at considerable cost, that it had never actually been dead at all. The answer that eventually reached the wider galaxy was never the whole truth, because the whole truth of the Hearth Fleet had never been a single battle, or a single weapon, or even a single promise. It was 11,000 people living out an ordinary life inside an extraordinary circumstance, and Wren understood that better than almost anyone aboard, because she had grown up inside the ordinary part of it. She had been born in a medical bay that smelled of shipyard steel, and she had learned to walk in a corridor that doubled, twice a week, as a schoolroom for every child in her age cohort, taught arithmetic by a retired engineer and history by her own grandfather, who had insisted, across every one of those lessons, that the fleet's children learn Earth's geography from maps 3 centuries out of date, because a home you had never seen was still a home worth being able to name the rivers of. She had celebrated 219 birthdays that were not her own, in a fleet small enough that everyone's birthday mattered to everyone else, and she had attended, across 24 years, the funerals of people who had died the ordinary way, old age, accident, the occasional illness no salvaged medical bay could fully outrun, long before she had ever attended one for a person lost to violence. It was this, more than the battle, more than the anvil lance, more than any single tactical decision she had made in the worst 13 minutes of her life, that Wren found herself trying to explain to the handful of Aldrune-Hold children who were allowed, in the fleet's second week at anchor, to tour the Ember Vigil's forward observation deck under careful supervision, their eyes wide at the sight of a warship's interior, clearly expecting something harder and colder than what they found. Because what they found, instead of a monument to violence, was a garden deck 3 levels below the bridge, hydroponic troughs running the length of 4 converted cargo bays. Growing food the fleet had learned to cultivate from seed stock that predated the long dark itself. Tended by off-duty crew who had never once, in 3 centuries, allowed the growing of things to become less important than the fighting for them. "Is this really a warship?" one of the children asked her, standing in the green, humid light of the garden deck, and Wren found she had to think about the answer longer than she expected to. "It's a home that happens to know how to fight when it has to," she said finally. "We didn't build the guns first. We built the gardens first, because you can't raise 3 generations of children on a ship that only knows how to make weapons. The guns came later, once we understood we'd need them to keep the garden safe." She watched the child absorb that, turning it over the way children do, testing whether it made the ship less frightening or simply frightening in a different, harder-to-name way. "Most days out here, nothing happens that anyone would ever tell a story about. We fix things. We grow things. We teach the next generation the names of rivers on a world none of us has seen. The story only starts when someone tries to take that away from us. That's the only time it's ever been about fighting at all." Dominion Central received Fleet Marshal Ashkel's transmission 6 days later, delayed by the ordinary lag of 40 light years and the extraordinary caution of every relay station along the way, each one bouncing the report upward through its chain of command with a note attached that amounted, in every case, to some version of "Please confirm. This is not a transcription error" before I forwarded any further. It was not a transcription error. By the time the recording reached the Dominion's ruling council, it had been independently verified by 3 separate archive divisions, cross-referenced against sensor telemetry recovered from surviving picket ships, and confirmed by no fewer than 11 Dominion officers who had personally watched 2,840 warships collapse into 380 in under 30 minutes, and had spent the intervening 6 days trying, and failing, to construct any alternative explanation for what they had seen. The council chamber where the recording was finally played held representatives from every major client species under Dominion authority, a body that had not convened in emergency session in over 40 years, and the silence that followed the recording's end lasted longer than the recording itself. It was an elder counselor named Rithen Vol, senior enough to remember a version of the vanished kin story from her own childhood that predated the sanitized official archive entry by at least 2 generations, who finally broke it. "My grandmother told this story to frighten me into finishing my studies," she said, and there was no humor in it at all. She said the kin went into the dark because they had grown too proud to stay where they belonged, and that the dark had swallowed them for it, and that pride like theirs was a debt the universe always eventually collected. I have told a gentler version of the same story to my own grandchildren. I did not think, even once in 80 years, that I would live to learn the ending was wrong." She looked around the chamber at faces that had gone, one by one, from disbelief to something colder and more careful. "The dark did not swallow them. They built something in it. And we have just discovered what, at a cost of 3,060 warships, and however many more will be lost by any fleet foolish enough to test the lesson twice." Not every voice in the chamber agreed with caution. A younger counselor, a military strategist named Corvin Idas, who had built his career on the doctrine that had governed Dominion border policy for 2 centuries, argued that a single engagement, however costly, did not constitute proof of an unbeatable force, that Ashkel's fleet had been undersupplied for the scale of the threat, that a properly prepared response with modern doctrine and coordinated multi-species support could achieve a different outcome. He was not shouted down. He was worse than shouted down. He was heard out patiently, in full, by a chamber that had already quietly made up its mind. And when he finished, Rithen Vol simply asked him one question. How many ships would you commit to prove your theory, Counselor Idas? And if the number you commit is wrong, who explains that miscalculation to their families? Idas did not have an answer ready. The council's final resolution, passed with only a handful of dissenting voices, Idas chief among them, designated the species human, formerly catalogued as the vanished kin, as an active and verified threat of unknown total strength, ordered an immediate cessation of hostile action anywhere near the Amrith verge pending further intelligence, and authorized a diplomatic overture rather than a second military response. A decision that would have been unthinkable to every officer in that chamber 11 days earlier, and now struck almost all of them as the only sane option remaining. It did not, however, strike everyone in the wider Dominion sphere that way. Word of the Second Correction Fleet's destruction spread faster than the Council's official resolution did, traveling through unofficial channels, private correspondence, and the specific gossip networks that move information between military officers faster than any formal chain of command ever manages. And it reached, among many others, a border garrison commander 3 sectors away named Prelate General Asan Tarl, who had spent the last decade building a reputation as the Dominion's most aggressively effective enforcer of frontier discipline, and who did not believe a single word of it. Tarl commanded a force smaller than Ashkel's, a mere 400 warships, but modern ones, purpose-built rather than salvaged, and he had spent his career operating on the conviction that any defeat, however dramatic, could be traced to command failure rather than genuine enemy capability. He requested, and against Dominion Central's own newly cautious policy received, authorization for a single reconnaissance in force. Not an invasion, he argued, merely a properly conducted intelligence-gathering mission that would either confirm or, as he privately believed far more likely, disprove the wild claims coming out of the Amrith verge. He found the Hearth Fleet 9 days later, resupplied and repaired at anchor near Aldrune Hold, and made the same mistake Fleet-Marshal Ashkel had made, in a smaller and more compressed form. Ren Calder was on watch when the censor officer reported the new contact, 400 ships materializing at the edge of the hold system on a cautious, deliberate approach that read, unmistakably, as a probing action rather than an outright assault. "They're testing us," she said, watching the formation resolve. "Someone back home didn't believe the report." Josiah Calder, fully returned to duty now, though still moving with the careful stiffness of a man whose ribs had not finished mending, studied the same plot beside her with an expression that held more weariness than alarm. There's always someone who doesn't believe the report until they've tested it themselves. It's not stupidity exactly. It's the particular kind of certainty that only breaks when it breaks against something real. He glanced at his granddaughter. "You have tactical experience now that you didn't have 2 weeks ago. What would you recommend?" Ren considered it for a long moment, weighing the same question her grandfather had weighed after the blockade engagement, not whether the fleet could win, but what the engagement should cost and what it should teach. "I'd recommend we don't let this one end the way the last one did," she said finally. 2,800 ships taught the Dominion that we're dangerous. It didn't teach anyone that we're not looking for a war. If we meet 400 ships with the full weight of everything we've got, all we do is confirm we're exactly the monster their old story painted us as. I'd rather this prelate general go home able to report something more useful than a body count. Such as the truth. That we can end this in minutes if we have to, and that we'd rather not, and that both of those things are equally real. Wren opened the fleet-wide channel, but kept her order simple, almost minimal, a demonstration rather than a battle. The escort screen extending to meet Prelate General Tarl's cautious probing advance with a precision and speed that stopped his lead squadron cold in under 90 seconds without a single shot fired on either side. 47 ships arranging themselves into a formation so absolute, so immediately overwhelming in its readiness, that Tarl's own censor officers reported afterward they had never seen a hostile force demonstrate combat capability without actually using it. Tarl held his position at the edge of the system for 6 hours, running every scan his ships were capable of running, watching the Hearth Fleet hold its formation without advancing, without firing, without offering so much as a single hostile transmission. And at the end of the 6 hours, he did something that surprised his own staff nearly as much as it would have surprised Fleet Marshal Ashkel to hear about it. He opened a channel and requested, formally, to speak with whoever commanded the fleet. Josiah Calder took the call himself, standing on the Ember Vigil's command deck with his granddaughter beside him, and found on the other end of the transmission a hard-faced officer who had clearly expected either a fight or a trick and had received neither. "You did not engage," Tarl said without preamble, the particular bluntness of a man testing whether politeness was a tactic he needed to bother with. "My reconnaissance force approached your position with weapons hot. You had every capability to destroy us in the same margin of time you destroyed the Second Correction Fleet. You did not." "No," Josiah Calder agreed, "we didn't." "Why?" "Because the Second Correction Fleet came to break a siege on people who never harmed us, and we came to stop that." "You came to look, and looking isn't a crime, Prelate General, even when it's done with weapons hot." Josiah Calder's voice carried none of the exhaustion that Wren knew he still felt in his ribs and his shoulders, only the same flat, unshakable certainty that had held this fleet together across 3 centuries of deep dark. "We're not looking for a war with your dominion. We're a fleet 314 years from home, and everything we've built out here, we built to survive, not to conquer. But we will not stand aside while the weak get crushed by the strong simply because standing aside would be easier. And if your dominion sends 4,000 ships next time instead of 400, the arithmetic will not change no matter how many times you rerun it. Take that report home and take it honestly. It'll save more lives than another siege ever could." Tarl was silent for a long moment on the other end of the channel, and when he finally spoke again, something in his voice had shifted, not warmth, not yet, but the particular respect that hard men sometimes extend to other hard men once they've stopped needing to prove anything to each other. "I withdraw my reconnaissance force," he said, "and I will take the report home honestly, Admiral, because I have seen enough today to know that dishonesty about this would cost more than my career is worth." A pause. "For whatever it's worth, I did not entirely believe the story either until this hour. I believe it now." He withdrew his 400 ships without incident, and the story he carried home, when it reached Dominion Central and the wider galactic community beyond it in the weeks that followed, did more to settle the matter than any battle could have. Not the tale of a myth-turned-monster, but the far stranger, far more unsettling account of a fleet powerful enough to erase an armada that had chosen, when given the chance, not to. The Hearth Fleet spent 6 weeks at anchor near Aldrune Hold, and Wren would remember them later as some of the strangest weeks of her entire life, not because anything else went wrong, but because for the first time since her birth, nothing did. There was no crisis, no failing recycler, no debris storm, no hostile contact closing on the formation. There was only repair work and rest, and the slow, careful process of 2 species who had never expected to meet each other learning, cautiously, how to exist in the same stretch of space without either one flinching. Aldrune Hold's fabrication yards, which had spent 19 days converting every available system into emergency defense hardware, spent the following 6 weeks doing something they found, by their own account, considerably more satisfying: rebuilding the Meridian sister ships, restocking the Hearth Fleet's depleted munitions, and in 100 small unofficial ways, simply making themselves useful to a fleet that had arrived from nowhere and asked for nothing in return. Warden Thrace visited the Ember Vigil twice a week, ostensibly for diplomatic coordination, though Wren noticed early on that most of the visits ended with him and her grandfather sitting quietly in the observation deck, two old men from two species that had never met before this year, comparing notes on the particular loneliness of command in a way that required no shared history at all, only the shared weight of decisions that cost other people's lives. The Meridian's 41 dead received a permanent memorial on Aldrune Hold's surface, at the request of the Hold's own people rather than the fleet's, a modest stone structure in the Hold's capital, 41 names carved into it in a script most of the Hold's population could not yet read, standing in a public square that Warden Thrace renamed, over the fleet's polite but firm objections, the Kindling Commons. "You didn't ask us to name anything after you," Thrace said, when Josiah Calder raised the objection formally. "You're right. We didn't ask your permission either. Some debts aren't the kind you get to refuse, Admiral. Let us keep this one." Josiah Calder let them keep it. Wren visited the memorial 3 times during the 6 weeks, and on the 3rd visit found Ensign Idris Farrow already there, standing quietly in front of the names, and understood, without either of them saying anything, that he had been coming more often than 3 times. "I keep thinking about the ones who almost weren't on that ship," he said when she came to stand beside him. "Every one of them had a reason they could have been somewhere else that day. Duty rotation put them there instead. That's it. That's the whole reason." He looked at her. "Doesn't feel like it should be that simple." "It never does," Wren said, and found she didn't have anything wiser to offer than that and didn't try to. They stood together in front of the 41 names for a while longer, and then went back to work, because the fleet still needed running and grief. 3 centuries of hard experience had taught this crew was something you carried while you worked rather than something you set the work down to feel. Word of the engagement continued to travel outward through the weeks that followed, reshaping itself with every retelling the way stories always do, until the version that eventually reached the farthest edges of Dominion space bore only a loose resemblance to the engagement Wren had actually fought. The numbers exaggerated in some tellings, understated in others. The anvil lance transformed by rumor into everything from a weapon that could crack a planet in half to a myth, invented by an embarrassed Dominion command to cover up its own tactical failure. Registrar Ilan Vase, watching the story mutate across a dozen different archive feeds from his post aboard the wreck of the Bloodclaim, still docked for repair, still technically under his administrative authority, though the campaign it had been built for no longer existed in any meaningful sense, found himself, for the first time in 30 years of cataloging dead civilizations, genuinely furious at the sloppiness of it. He requested and received permission to travel to Aldrune Hold in person 3 weeks after the battle, ostensibly to properly document the engagement for the Dominion's archive, and Wren met him at the Ember Vigil's forward bay with the specific wariness of someone meeting, for the first time in person, a man whose voice she had heard only on an intercepted enemy channel. "You called it right before anyone believed you," she said, by way of greeting, because it seemed like the honest place to start. "The myth cycle. You told your marshal it wasn't a warning about hubris. It was a warning about us. I told him, and he committed 2,800 ships to disproving me anyway." Vase's voice carried an old, dry weariness that Wren found she liked immediately, the particular exhaustion of a scholar who had spent his career being right about things nobody wanted to hear. "I have spent 30 years documenting species that no longer exist to correct my own mistakes about them. I find I would very much like to document one that does correctly before someone else gets the chance to do it badly." He looked past her, at the scarred hull of the Ember Vigil rising above the bay, weld seams over weld seams, 300 years of patient survival written into every plate of it. "May I ask you some questions, Lieutenant Commander? Properly this time." Not for a battle report, for the record itself. Wren looked at the old registrar for a long moment, at the careful, hungry attention in his face. Not the attention of a man cataloging a threat, but the attention of a man who had spent his whole career mourning things he never got to properly understand, finally given the chance to understand one before it was too late. "Ask," she said. He asked over the following days about the long dark and the 12 fragile arcs, and the 600 people who hadn't made it aboard before the launch doors sealed. He asked about the kindling oath, and the 3 centuries of patient, dangerous engineering in the cinder deep, and the particular arithmetic of building a civilization's worth of survival out of nothing but salvage and stubbornness, and the refusal to let any single generation's hardship be wasted on the next one. He asked carefully about Earth itself, whether the fleet knew if it still stood, whether the disaster that had forced the launch had ever been confirmed to have passed, whether there was any way, after 314 years, to know if there was still a home to return to at all. Wren did not have a good answer for that last one, and told him so honestly. "We don't know," she said. "That's the part of this most people don't understand when they hear the story. We didn't leave to explore. We left because we had no choice, and we've spent 3 centuries building the strength to go back and find out what's left, and we still don't actually know the answer. My grandfather was 19 when the doors sealed. He doesn't know either. Nobody alive on this fleet has seen Earth's sky in 314 years, and the last transmission we ever received from home cut off mid-sentence, and none of us know if that's because the equipment failed or because there was nothing left to transmit from." Vase was quiet for a long moment, absorbing that, and something in his careful archivist's composure cracked slightly, the way it had cracked once before, in the moment he'd first read the myth cycle aloud to a fleet marshal who hadn't wanted to hear it. "You fought an entire armada to defend a world that wasn't your own," he said slowly, "not knowing whether your own world still exists to fight for." "The oath didn't come with an asterisk for that either," Wren said, and found, saying it, that she meant it as completely as she had meant it standing on the Cutwater's tactical station 3 weeks earlier, watching 2,800 ships close on a formation that had already, 3 centuries ago, decided what kind of fleet it was going to be regardless of what waited at the end of the journey. "We help the weak being crushed because it's the right thing to do, not because we've confirmed there's a reward waiting for us afterward. If we only kept the promise on the days it was convenient, it wouldn't be a promise. It'd just be a policy, and policies change whenever the math looks bad." Vase wrote that down, and a great deal more besides, and when he finally returned to the wreck of the blood claim to begin the long process of properly rewriting 30 years of archive entries, he carried with him something he had not expected to find on this assignment at all: the specific, quiet conviction that the myth he had spent his career studying had never been a warning about hubris in the first place, and that the real lesson, the one his own people had somehow lost across 3 centuries of careless retelling, was a far simpler and far harder one, that some promises outlast the reason for making them. And the people who keep those promises are worth being afraid of only if you were planning to be the kind of enemy those promises were written against. In the quiet week before the council convened, Wren found her grandfather alone on the Ember Vigil's observation deck late one ship night, sitting in the dark with the running lights dimmed and Aldrune Hold's amber curve filling half the viewport, and sat down beside him without asking permission, because some conversations only happened if you simply arrived for them. "I don't talk about the launch much," he said, before she had asked him anything at all, as though he had been waiting for exactly this silence to say it in. 19 years old. "I remember the alarm klaxons more clearly than I remember almost anything from before that day, not because they were loud, though they were, but because I remember counting the people still running for the doors when my section sealed, and knowing some of them weren't going to make it, and not being able to do anything about it except hold the door open 4 extra seconds past the safety margin, because 4 seconds was all I had the authority to steal. He was quiet a moment, watching the amber light move across the glass. We lost count for years afterward, exactly how many didn't make it aboard. 600 was always the number we used, but I don't think anyone ever actually confirmed it. It was just the number that felt true enough to carry. Wren had heard fragments of this story her whole life, told in careful, sanded-down pieces meant for a child, and then, later, for a young officer who needed the history but not necessarily the weight of it. She had never heard it told quite like this, unsanded, offered without any attempt to make it easier to hear. "You've spent 314 years carrying 4 extra seconds," she said finally. "I've spent 314 years carrying 600 people I couldn't save, and hoping the 4 seconds meant something to the ones I could." He looked at her, and there was something old and unguarded in his face that she had rarely been allowed to see. "You held a door today too, Wren. 13 minutes of it, with a great deal more than 4 seconds worth of consequence riding on every one of them. I need you to understand something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just file it away the way you file everything else until you have time to feel it properly. You did not fail anyone today. Not the Meridian's crew, not the people still alive because of the door you held. Whatever this costs you to carry, and it will cost you something, it always does, you are allowed to also know at the same time that you did it right." Wren did not have an answer ready for that, so she sat with him in the dark a while longer instead, the amber light moving slowly across the glass, and let the not answering be its own kind of answer, the way it so often was between them. Ensign Dahl, Ray's part in the story, ended more quietly, though no less significantly to the people who lived it. He never met the Hearth Fleet directly. His reassignment kept him aboard the Blood Claim, feeding Vace's slow archive revision with the original Picket telemetry that had first flagged the impossible readings. But he submitted, at the end of the 6 weeks, a formal request for permanent transfer to the Dominion's Frontier Intelligence Division, citing, in careful bureaucratic language, his desire to specialize in the accurate early identification of anomalous contacts. The request was approved without comment, though the officer who approved it, a senior analyst who had read Dahl's original Picket reports in full, appended a private note to the file that read simply, "This officer was right and alone and said so anyway. Promote accordingly." At the end of the 6th week, Admiral Josiah Calder called a formal fleet council aboard the Ember Vigil, the first one held since the engagement, and only the 11th in the entire 314-year history of the fleet's journey, because a formal council was reserved for decisions large enough to require every captain's voice in the room rather than a single commander's judgment. 47 captains crowded into the Ember Vigil's largest compartment, a converted cargo bay that had, at various points across 3 centuries, served as a hospital, a school, a chapel, and a shipyard, and Wren stood at her grandfather's side as he laid out the choice in front of them. "We came out of transit 6 weeks ago expecting nothing more than a routine emergence and a long-range survey of unfamiliar space," he said. "We found a siege, and we broke it, and in the breaking of it, we've done something none of us planned for. We are no longer an unknown fleet moving quietly through the dark. Every major power within several hundred light-years of this position now knows our name, our capability, and roughly where we're headed. That changes the nature of the journey ahead of us, whether we like it or not." He paused, looking around the compartment at 47 faces that had, between them, spent centuries keeping this fleet alive through means far more mundane than a battle recyclers repaired at 3 in the morning, rationing schedules balanced against a crew's morale, 1,000 small, unglamorous acts of stubborn maintenance that had mattered as much to the fleet's survival as any weapon ever had. "I want to put the choice to this council honestly, the way the oath was always meant to be honored, not as a decision made for you, but as one made with you. We can press on toward Earth immediately, on the original heading, and accept whatever attention that draws along the way. Or we can stay in this region longer, help Aldrune hold and its neighbors consolidate against further Dominion pressure, and delay our own homecoming by however long that takes. Both choices honor the oath. Neither one is free. The debate that followed lasted the better part of 4 hours, and Wren listened to it with the specific attention of someone who understood, for the first time in her life, that she was not simply hearing her fleet's history discussed, but watching it being made in real time. Captain Akanjo of the Halloway argued for pressing on the grounds that 314 years was long enough to have kept an entire fleet's worth of families waiting to learn whether home still existed at all, and that further delay, however well-intentioned, risked becoming its own kind of failure to keep faith with everyone who had died along the way believing the journey would eventually end. An older captain, a woman named Farah Uzama who had commanded the fleet's medical division since before Wren was born, argued the opposite, that a fleet capable of breaking an armada was also, by that same capability, now responsible in a way it had not been before, and that walking away from a region it had just proven it could protect, simply because protecting it was inconvenient to the larger schedule, was exactly the kind of asterisk the oath had never allowed. It was, in the end, Warden Bellick Thrace himself who settled the question, invited into the council session by Josiah Calder's own request, standing before 47 human captains in a compartment that had served as a hospital and a chapel and would, this hour, serve as something closer to a courtroom of conscience. "I will not ask you to stay," Thrace said. "I understand what it has cost you already, simply to be here as long as you have been. But I will tell you what I have learned, watching my own world nearly fall and then not fall, because of a promise made by people who had no obligation to keep it. The debt of a promise like that is never paid by the ones who receive it. It is paid forward, by the ones who receive it choosing to become the kind of people who make the same promise to someone else, someday. If you leave tomorrow, Aldrune Hold will remember what you did for as long as this world has people on it capable of remembering anything. But if you stay a little longer, not forever, only long enough to help the Verge Conquered stand on its own before the next correction fleet decides to test the arithmetic again, you will not simply have saved us once. You will have given us the chance to become people worth having been saved." The council voted, in the end, for a compromise that satisfied neither the impatience of Akanjo's argument nor the full weight of Uzama's, and satisfied, in the specific practical way that 3 centuries of hard survival had taught this fleet to value compromises. Nearly everyone anyway, 6 additional months anchored in the Amrith Verge, helping the Hold and its neighboring free worlds establish the kind of coordinated defense that would let them stand on their own once the Hearth Fleet finally resumed its original heading. And then, at the end of those 6 months, regardless of what the wider galaxy made of the choice, the fleet would press on toward Earth. Because the families who had spent 3 centuries hoping had waited long enough. Josiah Calder closed the council with the same words his own grandmother had used to close the very first council, the night the launch doors sealed on a dying solar system, and 600 people who hadn't made it aboard, words that had been spoken at every major turning point in the fleet's history since, passed down not as scripture, but as the simple, load-bearing habit of a people who had learned that some sentences were worth repeating exactly, unchanged, across 300 years. Because changing them even slightly risked forgetting why they mattered in the first place. "We are the fire that did not go out," he said. "We carry it because someone has to, and because we are the ones who were asked. 6 months and then we go home, all the way through together or not at all." Wren watched 47 captains rise, one by one, and repeat the closing line back to him, the old ritual response that she had heard 100 times in her life without ever once, until this exact moment, understanding its full weight, not a promise made to a person, but a promise made to a story, passed hand to hand across 3 centuries by people who had never once let themselves believe it was optional. She said it herself, quietly, standing at her grandfather's side, and meant every word of it in a way she had not fully understood. She was capable of meaning it until the day the myth had turned out to be real, and it had turned out to be her. The 6 months that followed were not quiet, though they were nothing like the day the Second Correction Fleet had come apart in 30 minutes. The Verge conquered the loose alliance of small free worlds along the Amrith border that had, before the siege, never coordinated so much as a shared trade tariff, let alone a shared defense, found itself, under the patient guidance of a fleet that had spent 3 centuries learning to build something durable out of almost nothing, slowly assembling the beginnings of a combined defense network that did not depend on any single world's resources or any single admiral's presence to function. Wren spent most of those months on secondment to the Concord's newly formed Joint Command Staff, teaching formation kindling's underlying logic, not the specific tactics, which depended on hardware the conquered worlds didn't have, but the deeper principle beneath it, the idea that no world's defense should ever depend on being able to survive alone. It was demanding work, unglamorous in the way most real work is, full of committee meetings and resource allocation disputes, and the particular frustration of trying to convince a dozen sovereign worlds to trust each other's early warning networks with the same seriousness they trusted their own. But Wren found, somewhere in the middle of it, that she had grown to like it more than she expected to, because it was the oath's quieter half, the part that came after the fighting. The slow, patient work of making sure the next siege never got as far as this one had. There was one more test of the arithmetic during those 6 months, smaller than either of the first 2, and, in its own way, more revealing of how completely the story had already spread. A minor pirate consortium operating along the Verge's outer edge, hearing garbled rumors of a Dominion fleet destroyed by a species with no name in any registry, decided the rumor was almost certainly exaggerated, and that the Verge's newfound confidence made an easier target now than it had been before, when everyone was too frightened of the Dominion to organize a proper defense. They raided a mining outpost on the Concord's outer perimeter with 11 ships, expecting the usual light resistance a border world could muster on its own, and found instead a single Hearth Fleet escort cruiser, on routine patrol rotation, as part of the new combined defense network. Commanded by a Concord officer who had spent the last 4 months training under Wren's tactical doctrine, and had absorbed rather more of formation kindling's underlying stubbornness than she had entirely expected to teach him. The engagement lasted 6 minutes. 9 of the 11 pirate vessels were disabled and boarded. The remaining 2 fled and, by all subsequent reports, spread word through every disreputable channel available to them that the Verge's newfound protectors were not, in fact, exaggerated at all. Wren heard about the engagement secondhand, 3 days later from the Concord officer himself, delivered with the specific pride of a student reporting back to a teacher on a lesson well applied, and found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like weeks, not at the violence of it, but at the simple, quiet fact of a promise doing exactly what it was built to do in hands that weren't her own, in a formation that would keep working long after the Hearth Fleet had moved on to wherever the rest of its long journey led it. Admiral Josiah Calder's health, meanwhile, mended slowly and completely, though the surgeon noted, with the particular grim satisfaction of a medical officer who has finally won an argument, that he would carry a faint ache in his ribs on cold mornings for the rest of his life as a permanent reminder of the day he had discharged himself against direct orders. He did not seem to mind. He spent much of the 6 months doing the work he had always done best, not commanding from the front of a battle line, which had never really been his gift, but the slower, steadier work of keeping a community of 11,000 souls functioning as a single fleet across circumstances none of them had ever trained for, a skill built across 3 centuries of deep dark that translated, it turned out. remarkably well to the delicate business of helping a dozen suspicious sovereign worlds learn to trust one another. He and Warden Thrace became, over those months, something that could only honestly be called friends. Two old men from two species who had spent their careers carrying weights neither of them had chosen, and had found in each other's company the rare relief of being understood without needing to explain any of it first. Wren watched them sometimes from across the Ember Vigil's observation deck, sitting together in comfortable silence, and thought that this, too, was a part of the oath that no one had ever written down, because it didn't need writing down. The simple, human fact that the people who carried the hardest weights tended to find each other, eventually, and that the finding of them was its own kind of reward for the carrying. By the 5th month, the Verge Concord's combined defense network was functioning well enough, independently enough, that even Captain Akanjo, who had argued from the very first council session for pressing on toward Earth without delay, admitted, grudgingly, that the 6 months had not been wasted. The conquered worlds had begun training their own crews on formation kindling's principles. Aldrune Hold's fabrication yards had begun producing hull plating to human specifications, on the theory that a defense network was only as strong as its ability to repair itself without outside help, a lesson the Hearth Fleet had learned the hard way across 3 centuries, and was, in its own small way, passing forward exactly the way Warden Thrace had predicted it would be. And Registrar Ilan Vase, having spent 5 of the 6 months compiling what would eventually become the single most complete and carefully sourced account of the Hearth Fleet's history that any archive outside the fleet itself would ever possess, requested and received something no one, least of all Vase himself, had expected him to ask for: formal resignation from Dominion service, and a request to remain with the Verge Concord as an independent historian, on the grounds that a species capable of doing what he had watched the Hearth Fleet do deserved a more careful record than any government archive, built for its own institutional convenience, would ever be willing to keep. "You spent 30 years cataloging the dead," Wren said to him, the day he told her, standing on the Ember Vigil's observation deck with Aldrune Hold's rust-colored moon hanging steady in the viewport behind them. "Does it feel strange, cataloging the living instead?" "Considerably stranger than I expected," Vase admitted. "The dead don't argue with your conclusions, Lieutenant Commander. The living have an inconvenient habit of doing so constantly and being right about it more often than I'd like." Something that was almost a smile crossed his careful, weathered face. "I find I prefer it anyway. It turns out there is a particular satisfaction in getting a story right the first time, instead of spending 30 years slowly correcting the ways you got it wrong." In the last week of the 5th month, the diplomatic overture that Dominion Central's Council had authorized on the same day it heard Fleet Marshal Ashkel's transmission finally arrived at Aldrune Hold, 6 months later than it might have if the Council had not spent the intervening time arguing, in careful and exhaustive detail, about exactly how a government built on 3 centuries of frontier discipline was supposed to approach a species it had spent that same 3 centuries mythologizing as a cautionary tale. The envoy the Council eventually sent was not a soldier. This was, Wren understood immediately, a deliberate choice, a signal, sent ahead of any words the envoy might actually say, that the Dominion had drawn a lesson from Prelate General Tarl's reconnaissance that ran deeper than simple caution. Her name was High Arbiter Senekal, and she arrived aboard an unarmed transport with a Dominion honor guard reduced to a symbolic handful, and she requested, in her opening transmission, not a negotiation but a conversation, which Josiah Calder found, when he read the request, was precisely specific enough in its phrasing that he suspected the High Arbiter had chosen every word of it herself. She met the Hearth Fleet's council in the same converted cargo bay where the fleet had voted, months earlier, to stay the 6 months that had led to this exact meeting, and she did not open with an apology, which Wren respected more than she expected to. because an apology would have cost the Dominion nothing, and this, whatever it turned out to be, was clearly meant to cost something. "I am not here to apologize for the Second Correction Fleet," Call said, standing very straight in a compartment full of officers who had, 6 months earlier, ended that same fleet in under 30 minutes. Fleet-Marshal Ashkell made the decision he made with the information he had, and the information he had was 3 centuries of careless myth-making that my own government allowed to calcify into policy without ever once testing whether it was true. The failure that cost 3,060 warships their crews did not begin with Ashkell. It began with every archivist, every counselor, every officer across 300 years who found it easier to file the vanished kin away as a fable than to ask whether a fable was really the right place to keep a species capable of what you are capable of. I am here to correct that failure, not apologize for one man's decision inside it. "That's a fair distinction," Josiah Calder said. "What does correcting it look like in practice?" Call laid out the terms plainly, without the layered qualifications Wren had half expected from a government that had, until recently, treated her entire species as a bedtime story. Formal recognition of the Verge-conquered sovereignty, and the Hearth Fleet's right of passage through Dominion-adjacent space without challenge. A standing commitment that no further correction fleet action would be taken against any world under the Conquered's protection. And an offer, made carefully and without any expectation of acceptance, of safe conduct and resupply rights for the Hearth Fleet's continuing journey through the remainder of Dominion territory, should the fleet's course require it. "We are not asking for your alliance," Call said, when she had finished. "I understand that a fleet built on 3 centuries of self-reliance has very little use for one, and I would not presume to offer it as though we were doing you a favor by extending it. I am asking only that when the story of what happened here is finally told correctly, and it will be told correctly, Admiral, I intend to see to that personally. It includes the fact that once we understood what we had done, we chose to stop doing it, rather than simply to fear the consequence of continuing." Josiah Calder considered the terms for a long moment, the same slow, deliberate weighing Wren had watched him give every hard decision of her life, and found, at the end of it, an answer that surprised no one in the compartment more than it surprised the High Arbiter herself. "We'll take the recognition for the conquered," he said. "That protects people who can't yet protect themselves, and that's worth accepting from anyone willing to offer it honestly. We'll decline the safe conduct for our own journey, with respect and no hard feelings intended by the refusal. We've crossed 314 years relying on nothing but our own hands, and I find at the end of it that I'm not in a hurry to change the habit now, when we're this close to home." He held the High Arbiter's gaze, and something in his weathered face carried, for just a moment, the specific warmth of a man who had spent his whole life being harder than he wanted to be, allowing himself, briefly, not to be. "But I'll accept your word, Arbiter, that the story gets told honestly from here forward. That's worth more to us than an escort ever could be. A myth that gets corrected is worth trusting. A myth that just gets replaced with a bigger, scarier one isn't worth anything at all." High Arbiter Call signed the recognition accords 3 days later, in a ceremony attended by every Verge-conquered world and broadcast, at her own insistence, across every archive channel the Dominion maintained, not as a quiet diplomatic footnote, but as a formal, permanent, and very public correction to 3 centuries of careless record-keeping. And it was that broadcast, more than the battle itself, more than Ashkell's transmission, more than any rumor carried home by 380 broken ships, that finally and completely settled the question of what the wider galaxy now understood humanity to be. Not a myth, not a monster. A promise, 314 years old, that had finally come home to find the debt it existed to pay, and had paid it in full, and had then, when offered the chance to collect something for itself in return, chosen instead to simply keep going. The morning the Hearth Fleet broke anchor for the final time, half of Aldrune Hold's capital turned out along the orbital elevator's observation platforms to watch 47 warships align into departure formation against the pale amber curve of their world's atmosphere. And Wren stood at the Ember Vigil's forward viewport beside her grandfather, watching the crowds below through a long-range feed, and found that she did not entirely trust her own voice yet, so she let him speak first. "Your great-grandmother used to say the hardest part of the oath was never the fighting," Josiah Calder said, watching the same feed. "It was the leaving afterward. You help a people stand up, and then you have to trust them to keep standing without you, because the whole point of helping was never to make them dependent on it." He was quiet a moment, and Wren heard, underneath the words, the particular weight of a man who had spent his whole life leaving places he had come to care about, over and over, because the fleet's own promise had never allowed it to stay anywhere permanently. "It doesn't get easier. I want you to know that, since you'll be the one doing this long after I've stopped being fit to command a ship at all. It never gets easier. You just get better at doing it anyway." Warden Bellick Thrace's final transmission reached the Ember Vigil 20 minutes before departure, carried not through any formal diplomatic channel, but through the same open frequency he had used the very first time he had spoken to this fleet. 40,000 rescued lives and 6 months of hard, patient partnership ago. "I will not make a long speech of this," Thrace said, and Wren could hear, even across the transmission, that he was choosing his words carefully to keep his own voice from doing something he'd rather it not do in front of an audience. "I told you once that some debts aren't the kind you get to refuse. I meant it then, and I mean it more now, having spent 6 months learning exactly how much of yourselves you gave to make sure we could stand on our own after you left. Aldrune Hold will remember the Hearth Fleet for as long as this world has people capable of remembering anything at all. And when your journey brings you home, however far that is, however long it takes, I hope the fire you find waiting for you there is exactly the one you deserve to find, after having spent so much of it warming the rest of us first." Josiah Calder answered him with the same plainness he answered everything, though Wren, watching her grandfather's face as he spoke, saw something in it that no amount of 3 centuries of practiced composure had ever fully hidden from her. "Keep the commons tended, Warden, and keep training your people the way we taught you, not because you'll need it against us, but because the day may come when some other fleet from some other myth arrives at your door, and you'll want to be the kind of world that doesn't have to wait for rescue to survive it." A pause, and then, softer, the words the fleet's ritual never quite had space for, the ones that belonged only to 2 old men who had carried weights together for 6 months and would not in all likelihood ever speak to each other again. "Take care of yourself, Bellick. It was an honor." "The honor was entirely ours, Josiah," Thrace said, and closed the channel before either of them had to find out whether their voices would hold through a longer goodbye than that. The Hearth Fleet's departure burn began at the scheduled hour, 47 warships accelerating away from Aldrune Hold's amber curve in the same tight, disciplined formation they had held through every transit of the last 314 years, and Wren watched the moon shrink behind them on the aft display, the lights of 4 million people who owed their lives, in some measure, to a promise made by a woman none of them had ever met, dwindling slowly into the general starfield, until they were indistinguishable from any other inhabited world the fleet had never had reason to visit. "Set course," Josiah Calder said, and there was something in his voice that Wren had never quite heard in it before, not the flat certainty of command, though that was still there underneath it, but something almost fragile riding on top of it, the sound of a man finally, after 3 centuries of waiting, allowing himself to hope out loud. Original heading, Sol's system, all the way through together or not at all. "Course laid in, Admiral," Wren said, and found, saying it, that her own voice was carrying the same fragile thing his had, because some hopes were too large to keep entirely steady no matter how many times you had rehearsed carrying them. "Estimated transit, at current fleet speed, "61 years, sir." 61 years. Neither of them said the rest of the arithmetic aloud, because it did not need saying that Josiah Calder, 61 years old and finally, fully healed from a battle that had nearly ended him, would very likely not live to see whatever waited at the end of that transit, and that Wren, 24 now and already carrying more of the fleet's weight than most officers carried in an entire career, almost certainly would, and would arrive at a world she had never seen, carrying stories from a grandfather who would not be there to see if the stories turned out to be true. "Then we'd better make the 61 years count," Josiah Calder said finally, and there was, at last, something almost like peace in it, the particular peace of a man who had spent his whole life keeping a promise he had never fully expected to see the far end of, and had made his peace, somewhere across 3 centuries of deep dark, with the idea that some promises were worth keeping regardless of whether you personally got to stand at the finish line when they were finally paid in full. Idris Pharaoh found her on the Cutwater's small observation gallery an hour after the burn began, the amber curve of Aldrune Hold already shrinking into the general starfield behind them, and stood beside her in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had known each other long enough not to need to fill every quiet moment with words. 61 years, he said eventually. "Feels strange having an actual number attached to it now. Grew up my whole life hearing someday. Never heard anyone put a year count on it before." "Feels strange to me too." Wren watched the last of Aldrune Hold's light fade from view. "Doesn't feel real yet. Might not feel real for a long time. But I keep thinking about what the warden said, that the debt gets paid forward, not paid back. I used to think the whole point of this journey was getting home. I don't think that anymore. I think getting home is just the next place the oath gets to keep going, the same way it kept going today, the same way it'll keep going long after we've both stopped being the ones responsible for carrying it." "That's a heavier way of putting it than I was expecting on my first hour off duty in 6 months." Wren almost laughed, the first easy sound she'd made in what felt like days. "Sorry. You're allowed to just say you're glad to be moving again, if that's simpler." "I'm glad to be moving again," Idris said, and meant it, and stood beside her a while longer, watching the dark ahead of them fill in where Aldrune Hold's light had been. 2 voyage-born officers with 61 years of unknown road in front of them, and for the first time either of them could remember, no siege behind them, no armada converging, nothing at all in the immediate distance but the ordinary, unglamorous work of keeping a fleet alive one more day, and then the day after that. For as long as it took to find out whether the world they'd both been raised on stories about was still there waiting. The Hearth Fleet moved on into the dark, 47 scarred and weathered warships carrying 11,000 souls and 314 years of stubborn, patient survival toward a homeworld none of them had seen with their own eyes, leaving behind them a border region that would never again tell the old story about the vanished kin the way it had been told before, not as a cautionary tale about pride swallowed by the dark, but as the true and stranger thing it had always actually been. A promise kept by hands that had never once had the luxury of forgetting why it mattered, carried forward across a silence so long that an entire galaxy had quietly agreed to call it a myth, until the night the fire came back out of the deep dark exactly where it had always said it would, and found, waiting for it, a world worth having kept the promise for. Far behind them, on a world that would spend generations telling its children a new and truer version of an old story, a stone memorial stood in a public square called the Kindling Commons, 41 names carved into it in a script most of its readers had only just learned, and beneath the names, added by the Hold's own council after the fleet's departure, a single line that Warden Bellic Thrace had insisted on personally. Over the fleet's quiet objection that it was more honor than the moment required. The dark did not swallow them. They were never gone. They were only waiting for someone worth coming back for. And somewhere out past the edge of every registry that had ever called them a myth, 47 warships carried that waiting forward, 1 light-year at a time, toward a sky none of them had seen since before the fire first went into the dark to be kept.